My name is Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov." A soft, rhythmic sound of liquid sliding against metal filled the air. Two streams of pitch black, viscous fluid slid silently from specialized spray canisters, coating the floor in a dark, shimmering film. Pavel piloted his mecha with practiced ease, his movements possessing an eerie, elegant grace. He walked backward down the long corridor of the Victoria military officers' dormitory, his heavy steel feet treading softly upon the plush red carpet. With every step, he ensured that the black coating was applied evenly to every inch of the floor, the walls, and the ornate fabric beneath him. He thought to himself, "Well, that is my name now, at least. Just a few weeks ago, I lived in a modern city. I might have been a corporate slave or perhaps a freelancer. The memories are starting to grow a bit hazy, but I remember the essentials. I had health insurance, I had weekends off, and I had a PS5 waiting for me at home." Pavel reached a door decorated with intricate carvings, the kind of room that likely housed a high-ranking officer, perhaps a second lieutenant. He didn't bother with the lock. Instead, he simply tilted the remaining half-bucket of fuel and drenched the wood in the flammable liquid. "I lived in a villa area in the northeast of the city. Or was it an apartment building?" he mused, his internal monologue drifting as he worked. "It doesn't really matter now." At the far end of the corridor, shrouded in the deep shadows of the hallway, his deputy Grigory stood clutching a heavy machine gun. The man was visibly shivering, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He watched his captain move like a ghost right under the enemy's nose, pouring oil with the casual air of a gardener watering plants. The sheer absurdity of the scene made Grigory wonder if he had consumed too much industrial alcohol earlier that evening. Pavel finished his task and turned around. He tilted his mecha's head slightly to the side, raising a massive metallic finger to the front of his helmet in a universal gesture for silence. Then, he pointed toward the stairs, signaling a quiet retreat. "I should still be unmarried," Pavel continued his internal reflection. "I never smoked those cheap, nasty cigarettes, and I only ever drank in moderation. Every night, I made sure to be in bed by 11 o'clock, ensuring I got a full 8 hours of restful sleep." He took one final look at the oil tracks he had laid. In the pale moonlight filtering through the windows, the black liquid shimmered with a nauseating, rainbow-like luster, stretching deep into the darkness of the hallway. He nodded in satisfaction. Then, under Grigory's bewildered gaze, he reached into a tool pouch at the mecha's waist and pulled out a small box of matches. They were high-quality, windproof matches he had scavenged from a fallen enemy, premium goods that burned with a steady, reliable flame. "Before going to bed, I would usually drink a glass of warm milk and spend 20 minutes doing light stretches to relax my body," he thought. "I would wake up the next morning like a baby, free from fatigue or stress. My health checkups always came back perfect. I was a healthy man." A sharp rasp echoed through the silent hall as a match struck the box. A small, orange flame flickered into existence, cutting through the gloom. Pavel held the burning sliver of wood between his mecha's manipulators, not throwing it immediately, but watching it burn as if he were admiring a fine piece of art. The orange glow reflected off the cold, matte surface of his mecha's armor. Behind the reinforced visor of his helmet, his eyes remained calm, unnervingly, terrifyingly calm. "This is my attitude toward life," he told himself. "I don't get caught up in winning or losing, and I don't dwell on troubles. I don't create enemies that would make me lose sleep at night. I only ever wanted to live a peaceful life." He opened his fingers. The match traced a graceful arc through the air, falling toward the thick puddle of oil at his feet. A sudden, violent intake of air followed, a sound like a great beast gasping from the depths of hell. There was no explosion, only the roar of blue flames expanding at an incredible speed. The fire followed the oil tracks like a greedy serpent, racing down the corridor and into the darkness. In an instant, the freezing hallway was transformed into a roaring furnace. "Withdraw," Pavel said. His voice, projected through the mecha's external speakers, was flat and devoid of emotion, carrying only a mechanical coldness. He turned and gave his stunned deputy a firm shove toward the exit. The two mechas charged down the stairs toward the main entrance. This time, they made no effort to hide their presence. Their heavy iron footsteps thundered against the wood, making the rickety staircase groan and shriek under the immense weight. But, Pavel thought, Almost the moment they burst through the front doors and into the cold night air, a chorus of blood-curdling screams erupted from the second floor. It wasn't a sound that seemed human. It sounded more like the desperate, dying wails of a beast being flayed alive. Voices began to scream out from the inferno. "Fire, it's a fire," someone yelled. "Water, get some water, quickly," another cried out in panic. Then the realization set in. No, this wasn't an accident, someone set this. A desperate voice coughed through the smoke. The stairs are burned through, I can't see, my eyes." Pavel stood on the snow-covered ground in front of the apartment building and reached back to pull the heavy oak doors shut. A dull thud echoed as the doors closed, momentarily muffling the screams from within. But he wasn't finished. He reached for a thick iron chain hanging from a mounting point on his mecha's back, a chain originally designed for towing heavy artillery pieces. With practiced, efficient movements, he looped the chain through the ornate bronze handles of the doors. 1 loop, 2 loops, 3. But in this world, Pavel mused, there are always some impolite barbarians who refuse to let a man be. Inside, the trapped men began to throw themselves against the door. The heavy wood shook with the force of their desperate impacts. "There's someone outside," a voice screamed from the other side. "Open the door, please, I beg you." Another voice, thick with terror, shouted, "I am a Viscount of the Victoria Empire. Let me out, I have money, I can pay you." One man let out a final, bitter curse. "Cough, damn Ursus animals." Pavel remained deaf to their pleas. Under Grigory's horrified stare, Pavel pulled the chain taut and tied it into a permanent, crushing knot. He then reached down and picked up a discarded, broken steel pipe from the ground. Using the terrifying hydraulic strength of his mecha's arm, he twisted the thick metal into a mangled spiral, jamming it deep into the gaps of the chain. He had effectively welded the door shut with raw physical power. "Look at these people," Pavel thought as he stepped back. "Robbers from the Victoria Empire. They are crude, greedy, and have no sense of boundaries. Right now, they are the troubles that are hindering my sleep. They are my enemies, and I must eliminate them so that I can sleep soundly tonight." He took 2 steps back, admiring the scene as if it were a freshly completed oil painting. By now, the fire had shattered the second-story windows. Billowing clouds of black smoke and bright sparks shot into the sky, tearing a blood-red wound into the darkness of the pre-dawn horizon. "Damn Ursus scum," a voice shrieked from a window above. "You set the fire and then locked the doors, you insidious, cowardly sons of bitches." Another man screamed into the night, "Fight us face to face. What kind of hero hides outside while men burn? It's that bastard Pavel, isn't it? I know it's you, you despicable, shameless ah." The voices shifted from pleas for help to vicious curses, and finally to weak, gurgling cries before falling silent. Soon, the only sound remaining was the rhythmic crackling of burning timber. Grigory stood nearby, still clutching his machine gun. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly as it came through his helmet's comms. "Boss, what were you mumbling to yourself back there?" Pavel turned around, his back to the building that had now become a towering torch. The firelight cast a long, distorted shadow behind his mecha, stretching across the snow like the wings of a great demon. "It was nothing, Grigory," Pavel replied. He let out a soft, weary sigh. "I was just reflecting on how a kind-hearted, peace-loving man like myself, someone who would feel bad even stepping on an ant, is always being forced to do things like this." A massive crash shook the ground as the roof of the dormitory finally gave way, collapsing into the heart of the fire. A huge wave of heat and sparks swept over them, making the waterproof tarp on Pavel's mecha flap violently in the wind. Against the backdrop of the inferno, Pavel sighed once more, his mind already drifting toward the prospect of a quiet, dreamless sleep. The faint light of dawn pierced through the sulphurous fog, illuminating the desolate wasteland known as Caldeburg. On the border between the Ursus Union and the Victoria Empire, the permafrost defense line stretched across the earth like an ugly, jagged scar. On one side lay the dense concrete bunkers and crude steam pipe networks of Ursus, resembling a sprawling ant colony. On the other stood the steel fortresses of Victoria, shimmering with the polished luster of precision gears. Sandwiched between these two giants was the place Pavel now called home, or perhaps, more accurately, his grave. This was the 404th Independent Mecha Disciplinary Battalion. Every soul here was a piece of human trash, a degenerate, or a spectacularly unlucky scapegoat. Equipment was scavenged, supplies were stolen, and even the Thug-IV Mecha Pavel piloted was a stitched-together monstrosity, a patchwork of parts that had passed through countless hands. Pavel thought to himself, what a disaster of a situation. He steered the mecha through a muddy trench, the machine's heavy feet sinking deep into the muck with every step. The Thug-IV, which had just performed its glorious service in the arson attack, was now wheezing like an asthmatic patient, belching thick plumes of black smoke into the air. Although he had inherited the name and number of this body, Private Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov, number 44631, he had no idea what the original owner had done to end up here. Had he stolen the commissar's vodka, or perhaps slept with a general's youngest son? His memory was a total blank. But he knew one thing for certain. In this place, no one expected you to survive the next battle. A sickening crunch followed by a wet squelch echoed as the mecha's heavy hydraulic foot crushed a frozen corpse lying in the trench. Black blood mixed with ice shards splashed against the armor plating. As they approached the main camp, a few scattered cheers broke out. It was a welcoming ceremony fit for a band of outlaws. One veteran shouted, "Oh, look, Pavel's back." Another laughed, adding, "God, I can smell the roasted pigs from 3 kilometers away." A third man, missing an arm and covered in grease, hammered his fist against the mecha's leg armor with a dull thud. He yelled, "Great job, Pavel. You're a devious bastard, aren't you? Ha-ha." In the 404th, words like devious, despicable, and cruel were the highest forms of praise. They meant you had what it took to stay alive, even if your methods were as filthy as a sewer rat. Pavel didn't stop. He simply flipped on the loudspeaker. His voice came through the filters with a distorted metallic edge that masked its original tone. He said, "You flatter me, gentlemen. I just helped those Victorian lords turn up the heat a little. After all, it's the first day of the month of frost. We have to make sure they stay warm." A roar of crude laughter erupted from the crowd. Grigory followed behind him, head held high like a victorious rooster, acting as if he were the one who had set the fire. Leaving the rowdy mob behind, Pavel drove the mecha toward a row of dilapidated hangars in the corner of the camp. These so-called hangars were nothing more than sheds made of corrugated steel, drafty and leaking rain from their roofs. There were no maintenance technicians here. If you wanted to live, you fixed your own machine. If you couldn't, you simply waited to become meat paste in an iron coffin during the next deployment. Pavel backed the mecha into his own dim stall. He had personally reinforced this space, even adding a bit of soundproofing. Throughout the journey back, his nerves had been pulled taut, not because of enemy fire, but because of the machine itself. Now that the adrenaline was fading, a bone-deep exhaustion washed over him like a tide. With a heavy groan of metal, he manipulated the mecha's arms to pull the thick iron gate shut and slid 2 oversized bolts into place. He even dragged a pair of discarded gearboxes in front of the door for good measure. Only after confirming there were no prying eyes did Pavel finally let out a long, shaky breath. The hangar was dark, save for the faint glow of the mecha's dashboard illuminating the dust motes in the air. A mechanical voice announced, "System self-check complete, boiler pressure dropping, spinal nerve connection, preparing to disconnect." It was time for the moment he feared most, yet had to face. In this twisted world, controlling a steam mecha wasn't done with levers and steering wheels. That was far too slow for the chaos of the battlefield. To achieve peak reaction speeds, mad scientists had developed the Spinal-Direct Link system. Dozens of metal probes pierced the skin of the pilot's back, stabbing directly into the spinal nerves to fuse the human brain with the mecha's steam core. Man became machine, and machine became man. Pavel steered the mecha to the docking rack in the center of the room. With a screech of metal on metal, the machine slowly settled into a kneeling position. The roar of the boiler faded, replaced by the faint ticking of cooling metal. He whispered, "Disconnect." A sharp burst of electrical static hissed through the cabin. Then, agony exploded like a lightning strike. It felt as if someone were slowly peeling his spine out of his body, every nerve screaming in protest. The hydraulic probes at the back of the cockpit began to retract, pulling out from the gaps in his vertebrae. They emerged coated in thick conductive gel and streaks of blood. Pavel clenched his teeth, refusing to make a sound, though sweat instantly soaked through his bandages. His vision shifted from the panoramic monitors back to his own eyes, and his hearing returned to his ears. The feeling of omnipotence that came with controlling tons of steel vanished, replaced by the crushing weight and weakness of the flesh. Finally, the last probe broke free. With a hiss of released pressure, the mecha's chest armor popped open. Scalding steam billowed out, carrying the pungent scent of blood and disinfectant. A thin, frail figure tumbled out of the cockpit, hitting the cold floor with a heavy thud. Lying there was a girl who looked no older than 16, perhaps even younger. She had short, silver hair that looked brittle from chronic malnutrition. Her small face, stained with oil and grime, was so pale it was almost translucent, her delicate features twisted in pain. Her body was a map of scars, some old and dark red, others new and seeping blood. The skin on her back was a horrific sight. Rows of needle marks lined her spine where the probes had done their work, the flesh bruised, swollen, and in some places, festering. She lay on the floor, gasping for air as sweat and blood pooled beneath her. This was the body Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov now inhabited, and it was the primary reason he never dared to leave his mecha in the presence of others. Pavel lay flat on the cold floor, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The agony in her back refused to subside. Those spinal interface ports felt like red-hot iron nails driven deep into her flesh. Every breath she took tugged at her raw nerves, sending fresh waves of torment through her body. Sweat mingled with blood, spreading in a dark, slick pool across the freezing ground. Gritting her teeth, she pushed against the floor with trembling arms. Her elbows skidded on the grime and spilled machine oil, nearly giving out. It took 2 agonizing attempts before she managed to force herself into a seated position. "Damn it," she hissed, her voice a raspy, barely audible shadow of itself. Her vision swam, the cramped room blurring and tilting. The flickering light of the kerosene lamp cast long, distorted shadows that danced mockingly against the walls. She took a deep, shaky breath, forcing her mind to focus. Her eyes scanned the dim hangar until they landed on a medical supply crate tucked a short distance away. It was a collection of scavenged goods, items she'd either looted from past missions or swindled from her squadmates. Inside were a few rolls of bandages, a bottle of low-grade rubbing alcohol, a rusted suture needle, and a single injector of Penal Battalion Special Medical Agent. That medical agent was a miracle in a tube. One shot of that sludge, and even a man on the brink of death could claw his way back to his feet. No one bothered to ask what was actually in it. The only thing that mattered was whether you could still move. As for the side effects, only the living were privileged enough to worry about those. Pavel began to crawl toward the crate, her movements a desperate scramble of hands and knees. With every inch she gained, the wounds on her back tore further, weeping fresh blood that left a grisly trail behind her. Finally, her fingers brushed the cold metal of the box. With a sharp click, she flipped the lid open, sending the contents spilling across the floor. She snatched up the injector. It was filled with a thick, dark green liquid that looked more like industrial lubricant than medicine. The needle was thick and long, looking more suited for a piece of machinery than a human being. Pavel didn't hesitate. She tore away the loose bandages around her thigh, revealing pale skin already peppered with a constellation of needle marks and bruises. She pressed the tip against her outer thigh, took one last breath, and plunged it in. A sharp hiss escaped her lips as the needle pierced her skin and the viscous fluid surged into her muscle. It felt as though liquid fire was being pumped through her veins. The searing heat radiated from the injection site, racing through her circulatory system. Her body began to seize. Her muscles cramped uncontrollably, her fingers curling into rigid claws. She clamped her jaw shut so hard her teeth creaked, nearly biting through her tongue to keep from screaming. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Finally, the convulsions tapered off. Pavel slumped against the floor, panting heavily. Sweat soaked through her clothes and damp strands of hair clung to her face. But the pain was gone. The stinging in her spine had vanished, and the tearing sensation in her wounds had dulled to a faint thrum. In its place was a strange, heavy numbness, as if her entire body had been wrapped in a thick, protective film. She flexed her fingers. They moved. Pushing off the ground, she slowly rose to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, but they held her weight. She exhaled a long, weary breath and rolled her shoulders. Her mobility was back. She was still injured, but not in a way that would hinder her immediate plans. Pavel looked down at herself. Her pale skin was a mess of blood and filth, her bandages hanging in tattered, crimson-stained strips. The wounds on her back were still oozing, though the flow had slowed significantly. She curled her lip in a slight grimace. The recent sortie had been a victory, but the return trip had been a headache. A Victorian patrol had appeared out of nowhere, nearly cutting them off. Fortunately, she had plenty of experience in tactical retreats. She had directed her squad to scatter, using the ruins and craters as cover to lose their pursuers. She'd taken a few hits in the process, but nothing had pierced her armor or hit anything vital. It had just been enough to rip open some old scars. Nothing she couldn't handle. She shook her head, tossing her messy hair back. There was something far more pressing than her wounds now. She was hungry, starving in fact. Her stomach felt like a hollow pit, her intestines twisting in knots. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd eaten. Was it yesterday morning? The day before? The rations in the penal battalion were abysmal. A single daily serving of black bread hard enough to kill a man, and a bowl of vegetable soup so thin you could see your own reflection in it. Sometimes they didn't even get that. This was why she looted. Whenever she was out on a mission, she made sure to scavenge whatever she could from the enemy. The Victorian Empire's rations weren't exactly gourmet, but they were a king's feast compared to Ursus black bread. If she was lucky, she'd find cans, meat, fish, beans, anything. And if she was truly lucky, she'd find alcohol. Her eyes brightened as she turned toward the corner of the room. A small pile of crates and bundles sat there, salvaged from a Victorian outpost. Her squadmates had already picked through the high-value items, ammo, weapons, and primary medical supplies, but these were the bits she'd kept for herself. She scrambled over to the pile, her strength returning as the medical agent worked its magic. She even found herself humming a cheerful, vulgar military tune she'd picked up somewhere. She was off-key, but her mood was lifting. Today had been a good haul. She pried open the first crate. It was a jumble of junk, loose bullets, a few grenades, more bandages, and a rusted bayonet. No food. She shoved it aside and cracked the second one. This one held clothing, a few Victorian uniforms, and a pair of military boots that looked relatively new. Still no food. Pavel's brow furrowed in annoyance. The third crate finally yielded a prize. She found several cans, one marked with the Victorian imperial crest, likely containing meat, and another of beans that was slightly rusted but probably still edible. Then she saw it, a glass bottle half full of an amber liquid. Her eyes went wide. "Aha!" she exclaimed, snatching the bottle up. She yanked out the cork and took a sniff. The pungent, sharp scent of high-proof alcohol hit her, making her cough twice. It was at least 99% proof, a rare and precious find. Satisfied, she set the bottle aside and kept digging. The fourth crate was a bust, filled with useless documents and maps. The fifth bundle contained nothing but tattered rags and old socks. Pavel tossed the items aside, leaving the room in a state of total disarray. Cans, clothes, bullets, and maps were strewn everywhere. She was about to reach for the final parcel when she froze. She squinted, leaning in closer. There, buried at the very bottom of the heap, something was glowing. It wasn't the yellow flicker of her lamp or the dull reflection of metal. It was a soft, faint light that carried a strange sense of mystery. It looked like a firefly, but the glow wasn't green. It was gold. Pavel stared in silence. She reached out, brushing aside the debris to pull the object free. It was a small box, about the size of her palm, perfectly square and looking like a jewelry case. The material was bizarre, neither wood nor metal, but something she had never seen before. It was as smooth as glass to the touch, yet it felt warm, as if it possessed its own internal heat. Most peculiar of all was the light itself. A soft, golden radiance bled through the seams of the lid, standing out sharply in the gloom of the hanger. "What the hell is this?" she muttered to herself, turning the box over in her hands. There was no lock, no inscription, and no markings of any kind. It was a plain box except for the fact that it was glowing. She paused, her mind racing. How could a box glow? The technology of this world was stuck in the age of steam. Even the massive mechas were steam-powered. Where would a glowing box even come from? Her brow darkened with suspicion. She carefully set the box on the floor and scrambled back a few paces. Was it a trap? Those Victorian bastards were capable of anything. For all she knew, this was some new type of explosive designed to detonate the moment it was tampered with. But then again, if it were a bomb, why make it look so elegant? And why make it glow? She watched the box for a long time, her caution warring with her natural curiosity. Eventually, curiosity won out. Whatever, she grumbled. If it blows me up, at least I won't have to worry about the black bread anymore. She crawled back and crouched before the golden light. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the surface. It felt warm and gentle, but there was something else, a strange, rhythmic throb like a heartbeat. It felt as if something alive was trapped inside. Pavel took a deep breath, steeled her nerves, and flipped the lid open. A soft, metallic click echoed through the quiet hangar as the seemingly seamless box popped open, revealing a narrow sliver of space. There was no warning, no holy radiance like the treasures described in fairy tales. Instead, there was light, a cold, malicious glow that defied the very laws of physics. It didn't seem to radiate so much as it suggested the darkness itself had been forcibly torn asunder to reveal a hidden, ugly essence. Inside the box lay a raw, unpolished stone. Its surface was a sickening shade of dark red, but deep within, a thick, mercury-like iridescent glow swirled with a life of its own. Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov felt her pupils contract violently. Before her optic nerves could even relay a signal of danger to her brain, the light struck. It lunged like a predatory viper, following the line of her gaze and stabbing deep into her eyes. She tried to gasp, but the sound caught in her throat, emerging only as a broken, airy wheeze. In that single heartbeat, her world collapsed. It wasn't a visual darkness that claimed her, but a sensory overload so intense it threatened to unmake her. If the pain of the spinal probe extraction had felt like someone was draining her marrow, this was as if 10,000 rusted iron hooks had simultaneously snagged her cerebral cortex and begun pulling in every direction at once. A thunderous explosion seemed to detonate within the confines of her skull. It wasn't a metaphor. She genuinely felt as though her cranium had been blasted open, allowing a torrent of filthy, viscous, rust-scented sludge to be forcibly poured into her mind. Voices began to scream. "Kill, kill them all," one voice roared. Another whimpered, "Mama, it's so cold. My legs, where are my legs?" A soldier coughed through the sound of his own drowning, wheezing out, "For the Emperor, for blood, so much blood." A desperate plea followed. "No, don't shoot. I surrender." Then a hateful snarl, "Burn these Ursus bastards." There were too many voices to count. Hundreds? Thousands? No, it felt as if tens of thousands of dead souls were screaming, roaring, weeping, and begging for mercy inside her head all at once. Every voice brought with it the most vivid sensory experience of its final moments. Pavel felt her own throat being sliced open by a bayonet, hot blood spraying into her windpipe. A second later, she felt her lower body being pulverized by an artillery shell, her intestines spilling onto the frozen ground as the winter wind rushed into her abdominal cavity. The sensations shifted rapidly. She felt the searing burn of poison gas corroding her lungs, the sickening crunch of bones being crushed under the treads of a tank, and the acrid stench of her own skin carbonizing under the spray of a flamethrower. "Ah!" Pavel finally managed to scream. It was a piercing, wretched howl that didn't sound human, more like the final struggle of a wounded beast. Her hands, which had been propping her up on the floor, went into violent spasms. Her entire body arched and snapped like a live shrimp thrown into a boiling pan of oil, and she collapsed heavily onto the floor. Her small frame rolled frantically across the cold ground. She clutched her head with a death grip, her fingernails digging deep into her scalp and leaving bloody furrows behind, as if she were trying to physically dig the foreign presence out of her brain. She shrieked hysterically, "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Fuck you, shut the hell up!" Her voice was instantly swallowed by the psychic storm raging in her mind. The pain was unbearable. The noise was deafening. Her brain felt as though it were being brought to a boil. Her consciousness began to blur, the boundaries of her identity eroding under the tide of fragmented memories. She felt herself becoming the recruit who froze to death, the veteran blown to pieces, the Victorian officer crying for his mother. She struggled to remember who she was. Was she Pavel? No, she was Hans. She was Ivan? She was. No, she thought with a surge of primal fury, "I am fucking Pavel. Go to hell, all of you go to hell." A cold, mechanical voice suddenly cut through the chaotic symphony of the dead, sounding distant and detached. It announced, "Warning, high-risk mental pollution detected. Attempting to initiate emergency protocol. Loading, 1%. Pavel couldn't hear it. Her mental state was that of a rabid dog, snapping and tearing at anything that dared to enter her consciousness, whether they were ghosts or machines. She snarled at the void, "Get out! This is my body. This is my brain." With a desperate surge of will, Pavel slammed her head against the floor. A dull, heavy thud echoed through the hangar. Her forehead split instantly, and warm blood began to flow, blurring her vision. The physical agony was a mercy. Compared to the soul-tearing torment in her mind, the sensation of her flesh splitting against the concrete felt like a gentle caress. It gave her a single point of reality to cling to. The mechanical voice spoke again. "Notice, subject's mental state is extremely unstable. Forced intervention failed. Attempting to restart emergency protocol. Reloading, 1%. Strong rejection detected, loading failed." Pavel didn't stop. She slammed her head against the hard concrete and metal floor again and again, like a madwoman. Only the sharp, biting pain could confirm her existence. Only the smell of her own blood could help her distinguish reality from the hallucinations. The voice repeated its failure, attempting to restart emergency protocol. Reloading, 1%. Strong rejection detected, loading failed. Time lost all meaning. It might have been a minute, or it might have been a century. Gradually, the voices in her head began to recede. The agony of those final moments remained as a dull ache, but they were no longer vivid enough to drive her to madness. They were suppressed, forced down into the deepest recesses of her consciousness by her own cockroach-like tenacity, a stubborn, dark, and vicious instinct for survival. Pavel lay flat on the ground, her chest heaving as her body continued to twitch from the aftershocks of the assault. She looked absolutely wretched. Her forehead was a mess of torn flesh and blood, which flowed down the bridge of her nose and into her mouth, tasting of salt and iron. The bandages across her body had burst open again, her old wounds weeping fresh blood that mixed with the engine oil and grime on the floor. She looked like a demon that had just crawled out of a scrap heap. Her short silver hair was matted to her scalp with cold sweat and gore. Her eyes were bloodshot, her pupils dilated and unfocused, yet they held a terrifying, predatory glint. She stared at the box, which had rolled a short distance away. The gemstone had gone dim, looking like nothing more than a worthless, jagged rock. A short, sharp laugh escaped her throat. Then it grew. She began to laugh hysterically, the sound sharp and manic. Her body shook with the force of it, her wounds stinging and pulling with every breath, but she couldn't stop. She wheezed out, "That was so damn thrilling. If I ever touch Victoria's black technology again, I'm a son of a bitch." In the silence of her mind, the mechanical voice made one final entry. Protocol activation failed, suspending operations, switching to silent observation mode. The frantic laughter had been like a sudden thunderstorm. It arrived with violence and vanished just as quickly. As the final echoes died away in the cold, cavernous hangar, a deathly silence reclaimed the space. Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov lay flat on her back on the freezing floor, her chest heaving with exertion. Every breath she took sounded like the wheeze of a rusted bellows, accompanied by a wet, rattling sound in her throat. The bizarre box lay quietly by her hand. The heart-stopping red light and the swirling, iridescent glow had vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but a dull, lifeless piece of gray stone. It looked so ordinary that one might think the previous horror had been nothing more than a hallucination brought on by the brink of death. Pavel groaned, her voice a mix of a cough and a rasp. She struggled to roll over, attempting to push herself up from the floor, but as soon as she put weight on her arms, a wave of dizzying weakness washed over her. It wasn't just the pain. It was a profound sense of being hollowed out. That brief contact with the artifact had not only shredded her mental defenses, but seemed to have drained every last drop of physical strength from her body. She felt like a lemon that had been squeezed dry, shriveled, bitter, and utterly worthless. Her hand trembled as she reached out, fumbling for the medical kit she had kicked over earlier. Her fingertips brushed against the cold metal bottom of the container. It was empty. That single dose of Punishment Battalion medical agent had been her very last. She had injected it without hesitation to suppress the agony of her disconnected spinal nerves. But now, as the drug began to wear off, a deep, bone-marrow-piercing phantom pain was returning. It was more violent than before, her nervous system screaming in protest. If she didn't find something to soothe these volatile nerves, she wouldn't just fail to reach the battlefield. She wouldn't even survive the moment she tried to reconnect with her mecha. Damn it, Pavel hissed under her breath, her eyes scanning the mess on the floor. Aside from that mysterious broken box, her spoils from the day were scattered across the concrete: a Victorian officer's sidearm, a silver pocket watch, and several blood-stained medals. These trinkets couldn't save her life directly, but they could be traded for the things that would. She forced herself to stand, drawing on a final reserve of willpower. The next step would be the hardest. She looked up into the shadows where the Brute-IV Mecha stood in silent vigil. Its open cockpit looked like a mouth waiting to swallow a sacrifice, the sharp neural probes inside glinting with a cold, metallic light. To stay alive, she had to reach the black market. To reach the black market, she had to put on this iron skin. And to put on this iron skin, she had to let those needles pierce her spine once again. It was a vicious cycle, one that reeked of blood and engine oil. To hell with this world, Pavel spat, a glob of bloody saliva hitting the floor. She grabbed the bag of loot and staggered toward the machine. A heavy hiss of hydraulics echoed through the hangar, followed by a metallic thud as the locking mechanism engaged. The thick armor of the cockpit swallowed the small girl whole. Immediately after, a muffled groan was suppressed deep in her throat. Dozens of probes tore through her skin, sliding with agonizing precision into the gaps of her vertebrae. The pain arrived right on schedule, but this time, Pavel didn't even have the strength to shiver. She expertly bit down on her gag, letting cold sweat soak through her pilot suit as she waited for the neural link to stabilize. A low hum vibrated through the frame as the boiler ignited, sending steam rushing through the internal pipes. The panoramic monitors flickered to life, and her blurred vision was suddenly replaced by a crystal-clear digital view of the hangar. That false sense of power filled her body, temporarily masking her broken physical state. The hangar doors groaned open, and the massive steam mecha took a heavy, clanking step forward, breaking through the pre-dawn mist. The scenery behind the front lines wasn't much different from the battlefield itself. There were the same fields plowed by artillery fire, the same abandoned farmhouses requisitioned by the military, and the same gray, lifeless palette. The only real difference was that the corpses here had been cleared away, or rather, buried where they couldn't be seen. Pavel piloted the mecha forward, its mechanical feet digging deep craters into the muddy road. She felt terrible. Her brain felt like it was filled with hundreds of buzzing flies, a lingering side effect of the mental overload. But she had to stay sharp. Ahead, a village enclosed by a low wall appeared, marked on the map as an auxiliary facility of the 3rd Logistics Supply Station. Beneath that dignified official title, the largest barn in the village housed the busiest and filthiest black market in the war zone. Only there could she trade her blood-stained junk for the capital required to live a few days longer. The interior of the barn was far larger than it appeared from the outside. The space originally meant for grain had been partitioned into dozens of stalls, with goods piled high like mountains: rusted weapon parts, moldy military rations, medical supplies of questionable origin, and even the skeletal remains of stripped-down mechas. The air was thick with the smell of machine oil, rotting grain, and low-grade tobacco. It didn't look like a market so much as a distribution center for the refuse of war. But that was exactly why it existed. War creates trash, and trash can always be recycled if you can pay the price. Pavel walked the mecha straight toward the back of the barn. In the deepest corner, behind a makeshift desk constructed from ammunition crates, sat a figure hunched over a ledger. The man didn't look up, his pen scratching rhythmically against the paper as he spoke. "Welcome, customer," the man said. "What are you looking for? Medical supplies, weapon parts, or something else? My prices are fair, and I don't cheat the young or the old." He had likely repeated those words hundreds of times. They were a practiced instinct. Pavel didn't answer. She simply manipulated the mecha to take one more step forward, the heavy metal foot hitting the wooden floor with a dull, echoing boom. The man finally looked up. "I said, customer, what exactly do you?" he started to say, but his voice cut off abruptly. Pavel watched his expression shift from a professional smile to a look of pure horror in the span of a single second. It gave her a small, twisted sense of satisfaction. There was a long silence between them before the man suddenly leaped from his chair, nearly flinging his pen across the room. He shouted, Holy hell, how the FCK are you still alive? Sergei, my good comrade, Pavel's voice crackled through the mecha's external speakers, carrying a grating sense of mock friendship. It's been a long time, you're looking well. No, 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 the man named Sergei cried out, waving his hands frantically as if trying to ward off an evil spirit. Stay away from me, I am not your good comrade. I haven't even settled the last bill with you yet. Pavel tilted the mecha's head to the side, adopting a pose of feigned innocence. She asked, which bill would that be? Which one? Sergei's voice jumped an octave. A week ago, you brought me a box of spent shell casings and traded them for 20 rounds of live rifle ammunition. Oh that, Pavel replied dismissively. And 2 weeks ago, Sergei continued his tirade. You said you wanted to borrow 2 cans of medical alcohol, and what happened? I truly intended to return them, Pavel said. Bullshit, Sergei yelled. You never had any intention of paying me back. I just haven't found the right opportunity yet, Pavel countered calmly. And 2 months ago, Sergei started, but Pavel cut him off. All right, comrade Sergei, she said, her tone becoming firm. Let the past be the past. Today, I've come to do business in good faith. Look, I even brought the goods. Sergei stared at the mecha with the eyes of a man looking at a professional con artist. He asked skeptically, you, good faith. Of course, Pavel said. Someone from the 404th is talking to me about good faith, Sergei asked with a scoff. That hurts, Sergei, Pavel sighed. We in the Penal Battalion value our reputation above all else. Sergei almost laughed at the absurdity, but the laughter died in his throat. Pavel opened the storage compartment on the mecha's hip and pulled out a bulging canvas bag, tossing it onto his desk. The contents landed with a heavy, metallic clatter. Pavel commanded, count it. Sergei gave her a suspicious look before slowly untying the knot on the bag. As he peered inside, his expression transformed. He pulled out a beautifully crafted revolver, its frame engraved with intricate patterns and its grip made of high-quality peach wood. He whispered, "Is this a Victorian officer's sidearm?" He looked deeper into the bag and stammered, "And there are 7 of them." 8, Pavel corrected him. There's one more at the bottom. It's a custom model for officers at the major level or higher. The owner's family crest is engraved on the frame. I thought about prying the crest off to sell separately, but then I figured it would be worth more if I kept the piece whole. Sergei continued to rummage through the bag, his face becoming a mask of shock. He pulled out more items and asked, silver pocket watches, 2 of them, are these real silver? Only the cases are silver, the movements are standard issue, Pavel explained. But I assume you don't care about that. You'll probably just melt them down anyway. And medals? Sergei asked, his voice trembling. 3 Victorian Imperial Iron Crosses. 4, Pavel said. Oh, and there's a Viscount seal in there too, the one with the enamel inlay. Sergei sucked in a sharp breath and looked up. He asked, where the hell did you get all this? I picked them up, Pavel replied casually. Pick them up, Sergei repeated, incredulous. Some were gifts too, Pavel added. For instance, that seal. The Viscount said he didn't want it anymore. I just took it off his hands. It's a bit scorched from the fire, but that shouldn't affect the value, right? Sergei fell silent for several seconds. He looked at the loot, then at the featureless face of the mecha, and finally accepted the reality of the situation. He shook his head and said, You're absolutely insane. Thank you for the compliment, Pavel replied. Sergei didn't respond. Instead, he began to inspect the items seriously. His movements were quick and practiced. His fingers flew over the spoils, occasionally testing the metal with his teeth or holding a watch up to the light. After a few minutes, he looked up with a complicated expression. The haul was incredibly valuable, but he felt a strange reluctance to finalize the deal. Eventually, he managed to squeeze out a question. These things, they aren't exactly clean, are they? Sergei asked. Don't give me that crap, Pavel retorted with a mental roll of her eyes. Are you clean? You sell military supplies you borrowed from the rear warehouses, and you buy loot stripped from dead men. Is there a single part of your business that isn't filthy? Sergei opened his mouth, the words of a rebuttal dying in his throat as he realized there was truly no ground left to stand on. He sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, he muttered. You're a hard one to argue with. You win this round. He gestured toward the crates stacked in the shadows of the barn, the wood damp and smelling of old grain. As for the medical supplies, there's no issue there. I've got bandages, high-grade alcohol, suturing needles, and the medical agents you need right here. I have the stock on hand, and I can hand it over to you immediately. Pavel didn't move the mecha, the heavy machine standing like a silent sentinel in the dim light of the silo. And the weapons? She asked, her voice amplified and distorted by the mecha's external comm system, sounding like grinding metal. Sergei's expression shifted, becoming uncharacteristically subtle. He rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit that didn't escape Pavel's notice. The weapons? He began, his voice trailing off as he looked toward the barn's entrance. Look, friend, things are getting tight on the front lines. The brass is cracking down, and moving hardware like that is getting dangerous. My usual channels are currently, let's say, under observation. Inside the cockpit, Pavel felt a familiar surge of cynicism. She thought to herself, here it comes, the pivot. So, Pavel prompted, her tone flat and unforgiving. So, I have a better proposal, Sergei said, a greasy, salesman-like smile spreading across his face. He lowered his voice, leaning in toward the mecha as if the walls themselves had ears. I'm thinking of settling the weapons portion of our trade with something far more valuable than a few standard-issue rifles. Information, Pavel asked, her skepticism clear. Not just any information, Sergei insisted, tapping his temple. Valuable information, extremely valuable. Pavel remained silent for a long 2 seconds, the only sound in the barn being the low hum of the mecha's power core. Without a word, she began to manipulate the controls, the mecha's mechanical hands reaching out to gather the items she had already placed on the table. She made it clear she was preparing to leave. Wait, hold on, Sergei cried out, his composure breaking as he waved his arms frantically. At least let me finish. There's no need, Pavel replied, her voice cold and dismissive. Comrade Sergei, I came here to do business, not to listen to fairy tales. If you don't have the goods, I'll find someone who does. Don't be like that. Look, I'm calling you brother here. This intel is truly something special, Sergei pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. Pavel paused, the mecha's arm hovering midair. She was still doubtful, but the desperation in Sergei's voice was intriguing. Fine, she said, her voice carrying a sharp, threatening edge. I'll give you exactly 1 sentence, but before you speak, I suggest you think very carefully. If you waste my time, you won't like the consequences. Sergei's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, the threat hanging heavy in the air. He licked his dry lips and leaned in even closer, his voice a mere whisper. Do you know about the shipment of experimental Victoria weapons that the front lines captured recently? The mecha's internal systems whirred as Pavel went still. Experimental weapons, she repeated. Sergei's eyes lit up, seeing that he finally had her attention. Exactly. Word is there the latest research results from Victoria. The destructive power is supposed to be terrifying. The High Command is treating them like crown jewels, and they've sent a special detail to escort them to the rear for study. And what does that have to do with me? Pavel asked. Sergei grinned, a look of pure mischief in his eyes. It has everything to do with you because that shipment is currently sitting in a warehouse not far from here. And as it happens, I know the man guarding the door. The pieces clicked into place in Pavel's mind. Oh, she said, her voice dropping an octave. You want me to steal them? Steal? No, Sergei said, choosing his words with practiced care. Let's call it borrowing. Borrowing? Pavel asked, her tone mocking. That's right, Sergei said, gesturing broadly. We borrow a few pieces, and everyone gets a piece of the pie. You provide the muscle and the pilot skills, and I provide the intel and the cover. Once it's done, you keep one for yourself, and we split the rest 70-30. 70-30? Pavel asked. Yeah, 70 for me, 30 for you, Sergei confirmed, looking far too proud of himself. Pavel let out a long, slow breath that turned into a low, rumbling chuckle through the speakers. So, she said, her voice stretching out the word. You want me, a disposable pilot from a punishment battalion, to go and rob a high-security warehouse guarded by regular Ursus troops for top-secret weapons. I take all the risk, and if we succeed, you take 70%. Sergei's smile froze, his face turning a pale shade of gray. "I have to ask, Comrade Sergi," Pavel said, taking a heavy step forward. The floorboards groaned and splintered under the mecha's weight, leaving a shallow crater in the wood. "Do you think I'm an idiot, or do you just think I'm an easy target?" No, let me explain," Sergi stammered, backing away. "Do I look like the kind of fool who gets talked into a suicide mission for scraps?" Pavel interrupted, her voice like ice. "Of course not, but," Sergi tried to interject. "Have you even thought about what happens if this fails?" Pavel continued, her tone relentless. "Stealing military supplies is a capital offense. It's a firing squad on the spot. You'll be tucked away back here, safe and sound, while I'm the one with my neck on the line. If things go south, you'll just wash your hands of me and claim you've never seen me before. Tell me, Sergi, what exactly do you take me for?" Sergi opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely cornered by her logic. After a long silence, Pavel spoke again. "The split is 70-30, Pavel stated firmly, "but I get the 70. Sergi blinked, stunned. "What?" "And," Pavel added, "you're throwing in these medical supplies for free as a down payment." Sergi's face twisted in pain. "Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov, you're pushing it. That's highway robbery." "Is it?" Pavel asked, the mecha taking another menacing step forward. Sergi threw his hands up in surrender, letting out a long, weary sigh. Fine, they're yours, just take them." He muttered under his breath, "You're a nightmare to deal with, you know that." Pavel gave a non-committal grunt. She had known exactly what Sergi was up to the moment he opened his mouth, but she had never intended to refuse. In this war-torn hellscape, dying in battle because of a lack of ammunition was no different from being executed for theft. At least the latter was a quicker end. If these experimental Victoria weapons were even half as powerful as Sergi claimed, they might be the only thing that kept her alive in the next engagement. Plus, getting the medical supplies and the intel for free was a deal she couldn't pass up. It was a calculated risk with a massive payout. "Now," Pavel said, her voice returning to a businesslike clip, "give me the details. I want the full intel." "Don't rush me," Sergi grumbled. He reached under the table and pulled out a crumpled, stained map, smoothing it out with trembling fingers. "I'll walk you through it piece by piece. Look here first." As Sergi began to point out the guard rotations and entry points, a strange feeling washed over Pavel. She felt like she had made a vow to herself not too long ago, something about staying out of trouble and living a quiet life. She sighed inwardly, so much for that. That old dog Sergi actually came through with accurate intel this time, Pavel thought to herself as she stood before a massive Type 1 shipping crate. The lid had already been pried open, and the mangled remains of 3 heavy mechanical locks lay scattered at her feet like discarded scrap. The journey into the heart of the facility had been a masterclass in high-stakes stealth. She had successfully navigated past 3 separate patrols of heavy infantry, bypassed 2 steam pressure mines disguised as ventilation ducts, and even crawled through a derelict drainage pipe to avoid the automated turrets at the main gate. Those turrets, captured from Victoria and refitted with Ursus identification systems, would have made short work of her if she hadn't known exactly where to move. The security here was absurdly tight. If Sergi hadn't provided a structural map highlighting a specific blind spot in the sensors, Pavel knew she would have been turned into a sieve the moment she stepped inside. This level of protection confirmed her suspicions. The cargo was invaluable. Her risky excursion into the dark wasn't going to be a waste of time after all. However, the object resting inside the crate was not at all what she had expected. It was a sword. For a human, it was a blade of unimaginable proportions, with a hilt as thick as a grown man's thigh. But for a steam mecha standing nearly 3 meters tall, it was a standard-sized arming sword, appearing almost elegant and light in its design. It hung suspended within the crate, held fast by a complex restraint system made of brass and stainless steel. These weren't simple clips. It was a hydraulic clamping system that was still slowly cycling, maintaining a constant grip. Dozens of copper pipes, each as thick as a wrist, connected the hilt and various nodes along the blade to a central pressure system. On the nearby gauges, the needles quivered near the red line, as if the weapon itself were a wild beast that required constant suppression. The blade possessed a dull, matte black iron finish. Its surface wasn't smooth like a mirror. Instead, it was covered in a network of fine, protruding heat conduction pipes that looked like metallic veins pulsing with hidden energy. The edge wasn't sharpened to a traditional point. Instead, it featured rows of terrifyingly fine chainsaw teeth, likely part of a high-frequency vibration generator. At the crossguard, a small, independent high-pressure boiler was embedded. It was currently in a dormant state, but the heavy valves and thick exhaust ports made it clear that once ignited, it would unleash a terrifying amount of kinetic energy. "But it's still just a sword," Pavel muttered under her breath, her voice crackling through the mecha's internal comms. She felt a wave of absurdity wash over her. Had the Victorian aristocrats finally let the steam go to their heads? In an era where massive cannons and long-range fire ruled the battlefield, creating a cold weapon like this was archaic to the point of stupidity. She thought to herself, "I spent half the night crouching in a sewer just for this." With a sigh, she extended a cutting blade from her mecha's right arm and began the tedious process of dismantling the brass lines. She tried to look on the bright side. The thing looked heavy and sturdy. Even if it wasn't practical as a sword, it would probably do a fine job of smashing in someone's cockpit. Besides, she was already here. She couldn't exactly leave empty-handed. Suddenly, a low, heavy thud echoed from deep underground, vibrating through the very foundations of the building. A split second later, the entire warehouse floor bucked violently. A massive explosion roared through the air, the sound so loud it felt like a physical blow. Above her, the gas lamps shattered instantly, raining shards of glass down like a deadly storm. Although the thick walls of the warehouse absorbed the worst of the shockwave, the vibration traveled through the feet of her mecha and straight up Pavel's spine. Artillery, Pavel's pupils contracted as she checked her sensors. This wasn't the vibration of a small-caliber mortar used for harassment. This was the signature of a Victorian Empire Queen-class field gun, and the impact was incredibly close. Before she could even steady herself, a piercing alarm tore through the night sky. The wailing sound was the distinct air raid siren of the Ursus allied forces, shrill and sharp, sounding like a rooster being strangled in its final moments of life. "All units attention, all units attention, we have contact across the entire line. I repeat, contact across the entire line." A commander's voice screamed over the base intercom. His frantic shouting was nearly drowned out by the sounds of heavy gunfire and distant screams echoing from the perimeter. Pavel froze, her cutting blade hovering just inches above a brass pipe. This was the third logistics supply station. If even this deep-rear location was being hit by that kind of heavy artillery, a cold chill ran down her spine. It meant the front line had been completely shattered. She knew the Victorian tactical style all too well. Once those lunatics used their artillery for total fire coverage, their pride and joy would follow. The Iron Night Charge. Those noblemen, with their brightly painted armor and family crests, would be piloting elite mecha with performance far exceeding the scrap heaps used by Ursus. They would cut through the defensive lines like a hot knife through butter and push deep into the rear at high speed. Infantry would follow, surrounding the scattered Ursus defenders and slaughtering them like livestock. This meant she wasn't just behind enemy lines, she was about to run headfirst into Victoria's most elite mecha knight order. Pavel looked back at the black sword locked in its cradle. What should she do? Should she keep going? She hesitated for only a second. To be precise, it was exactly 0.8 seconds. She knew that facing Victorian royal knights with a piece of junk gun that could barely dent their plating meant her survival rate was 0. But if she had something in her hands that could actually smash through their turtle shells, that survival rate might climb to 30 or even 20%. A distorted, weary sigh escaped the mecha's external speakers. "Whichever bastard ordered that opening volley, I hope you wet the bed tonight." Pavel abandoned all caution. The rough mechanical arms of her mecha, nicknamed the Thug, no longer tried to delicately unfasten the locks. Instead, she grabbed the central brass valve of the restraint system. With the engine roaring in an intentional overload, she wrenched it outward with all her might. "Get out of there," she growled, the mecha's actuators screaming under the strain. With a screech of tearing metal that set her teeth on edge, the black sword was ripped from its complex housing. Severed copper pipes sprayed scalding steam and hydraulic oil everywhere, splashing against the Thug's rusted armor plates. Just as Pavel pulled the sword free, another massive explosion rocked the world. A shell had scored a direct hit on the warehouse roof. This time, there was no barrier and no buffer. The ceiling collapsed instantly, sending massive chunks of concrete and twisted rebar falling like meteors. The entire world trembled in the heat of the flames, as if the end of days had finally arrived. Deep within her mind, a series of Crimson System warnings flickered into existence. A mechanical voice echoed in her ears, warning that high-risk mental pollution was accelerating, currently reaching 67%. It flagged the host's vital signs as abnormal and announced that a forced intervention was beginning, activating emergency protocols as the darkness of the collapsing building closed in. A torrent of iron ground across the earth, the roar of steam tearing through the silent night sky. 12 Victoria Royal Mecha Knights advanced in a tight wedge formation, their massive frames cutting through the darkness. Unlike the rusted, patched-together junk heaps favored by Ursus, these war machines were finished in a deep, ink-black lacquer. Brass filigree adorned their joints, and their breastplates bore the proud heraldry of their respective houses: griffins, roses, and crossed swords, all shimmering with a cold, metallic luster under the flickering light of distant artillery fire. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, moving with the grace of a well-trained cavalry squadron. Every turn and every burst of acceleration was executed in seamless harmony. This was the art of war that the Victoria Empire took the most pride in, the massed charge of a Mecha Knight regiment. At the very tip of this steel spearhead, a particularly slender mecha led the way at a staggering speed. Its paint job stood in stark contrast to the somber blacks of its peers. It wasn't a dignified obsidian, but a piercing, vivid crimson, the color of clotted blood or a rose in full bloom. On its left shoulder guard, an exquisite family crest flickered in the firelight. A black rose entwined with thorns, its petals stained with 3 distinct drops of blood. It was the crest of the House of von Schwartz. Inside the cramped, humming cockpit, a cold, feminine voice broke the silence. 200 meters ahead, enemy fire point, 11 o'clock direction, she announced. A subordinate's voice crackled over the comms channel, filled with professional respect. Understood, Your Excellency. Eleanor von Schwartz didn't hesitate as she issued her next commands. 3rd Squad, begin the flanking maneuver. 4th Squad, provide frontal suppression. The rest of you, follow me for the breakthrough. The moment the orders left her lips, the Crimson Mecha surged forward, leaving the others in its wake. Behind the controls, a pair of ice-blue eyes stared intently at the unfolding battlefield. This was Eleanor von Schwartz, the acting commander of the 7th Mecha Knight Regiment of the Victoria Empire. At only 19 years old, she had already been granted the title of Baroness for her military achievements. To her allies and enemies alike, she was known as the Blood Rose, a genius pilot with a reputation for lethal precision. A dangerous smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, a look of predatory satisfaction. She whispered softly to herself, her voice carrying a hint of genuine intoxication. What a truly wonderful night. Ahead of her, the Ursus defensive line was in the midst of a total collapse. The poor defenders had been basking in the joy of their supposed victory earlier that day, never imagining that Victoria would launch such a massive counteroffensive under the cover of darkness. Their command structure had dissolved into chaos the moment the first round of heavy artillery fire had rained down upon them. Now, the iron hooves of the Mecha Knight Regiment were arriving to finish what the guns had started. Her adjutant's voice broke through her thoughts. Your Excellency, enemy mecha detected ahead, 3 units. They are attempting to organize a defensive line. Eleanor let out a soft, mocking laugh. Only 3, she asked. The people of Ursus are becoming increasingly stingy with their lives. She pushed her mecha to its limits, charging toward the 3 Ursus machines that were desperately trying to form a line. They were clearly a makeshift force, thrown together in a panic. 2 were ancient Guardian V models, their armor covered in the scars of a dozen previous repairs. The 3rd was a more modern mainline unit, but it stood at a precarious tilt, suggesting its leg joint systems were already failing. Over the open comms, the hysterical roar of the enemy commander echoed. Stop them, for Ursus. The 3 Ursus mechas raised their weapons, 2 heavy machine guns and a small-caliber rapid-fire cannon, and unleashed a hail of lead toward the charging Victorian knights. Bullets rained down, sparking against the ground and air. Eleanor didn't even bother to slow down. She clicked her tongue in annoyance. With a deft movement of the controls, her mecha leaned to the side, sliding through the gaps in the bullet curtain at an impossible angle. Simultaneously, her right hand reached back to draw the weapon mounted on her back. It was a long, elegant lance, its shaft engraved with intricate patterns. Faint blue steam hissed from the tip, shimmering with heat. "That's the first one," Eleanor said coldly. The crimson mecha became a streak of bloody lightning as it slammed into the enemy formation. The lance punched through the breastplate of the first Guardian V with terrifying ease. High-pressure steam erupted from the tip of the weapon instantly, vaporizing everything inside the cockpit in a flash of white heat. Eleanor didn't stop. She twisted the lance, using the momentum to swing the dead weight of the skewered mecha into the second enemy unit. The two machines collided with a deafening crash of metal on metal, tangling together as they collapsed into the dirt. The third unit, the one with the damaged leg, hadn't even finished traversing its cannon when Eleanor was already upon it. Her lance struck like a viper's tongue, precisely piercing the machine's knee joint. The pilot's scream of agony tore through the radio as his machine's leg was severed. Deprived of its support, the heavy machine crashed to the ground, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. From the start of the charge to the end of the skirmish, barely 12 seconds had passed. Eleanor retracted her lance, her voice dripping with disappointment. "How boring," she muttered. "Your Excellency, the third squad has completed the encirclement, and the fourth squad is mopping up the remaining resistance," her adjutant reported. "The target village is directly ahead." "Good," Eleanor replied, tilting her mecha's head to look forward. The village, surrounded by low stone walls, was burning. It was more than just a settlement. It was the core warehouse complex for the Ursus Allied Forces' 3rd Logistics Supply Station. The artillery had already cleared a path for them. Eleanor's voice turned cold as she addressed her entire unit. "All units, listen up. Our objective is the warehouse district. Intelligence suggests that the experimental weapons our forces lost in previous engagements are likely stored here. Find them, destroy them or recover them, but leave no trace behind." "By your command," 11 voices responded in unison. Eleanor paused, that dangerous smile returning to her face. "And one more thing," she added, "if you encounter any resistance, do not hold back." 5 minutes later, the village had fallen completely. The buildings once used to store vital supplies were now a sea of fire, with thick black smoke billowing into the heavens. Scattered gunshots still rang out as Victoria infantry moved through the ruins, hunting down the last of the defenders. Eleanor's mecha stood tall in the center of the village square, its foot planted firmly on the chest of a destroyed Ursus machine. It was the personal craft of the supply station's commander, an Iron Guard Mark III. It was a decent machine, but now its breastplate had been torn open, exposing the cockpit to the smoky air. Inside, the pilot was still alive, letting out weak, wet coughs. The commander, his face covered in blood, peered out from the wreckage. He glared at Eleanor's towering machine with eyes full of pure hatred. "You Victoria, dogs," he wheezed. "You, invaders." Eleanor looked down at him, tilting her mecha's head as if she were observing a particularly interesting insect. "Invaders?" she asked, her voice projecting through the external speakers with an air of elegant mockery. "Commander, it was your people who crossed the border first. We are merely taking back what belongs to us." "Bullshit," the commander spat, coughing up more blood. "This land has always belonged to Ursus, you greedy thieves." He struggled to crawl out of the mangled cockpit, but his legs were pinned by twisted metal. Every movement only caused more blood to soak into his uniform. "There is no need for a history lesson," Eleanor said dismissively. She manipulated the controls, slowly raising her lance. "You should be proud of your courage, Commander. To organize such a decent resistance in the face of absolute defeat is a rare feat for an Ursus man." The distance between the two combatants was vanishingly small. Eleanor von Schwartz stared intently at the battered, scrap metal mecha before her, feeling a cold sweat trickle down her spine. The deafening roar of metal grinding against metal filled the air as her heavy lance locked in a desperate stalemate with that pitch-black longsword. Her entire mecha's frame groaned under the immense pressure, the structural supports screaming in protest as they reached their breaking point. What kind of monster is sitting in that cockpit? Eleanor wondered, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and disbelief. But there was no time for contemplation. The second strike was already descending upon her with terrifying speed. A heavy impact shook the ground as the lance parried the blow once more. This time, however, Eleanor felt a distinct shudder through the control systems, a vibration that told her the force behind the strike was heavier than the first. No, it wasn't just heavier, it was more precise. The first strike had been pure, raw strength, like the desperate pounce of a cornered beast, but this second blow was different. Its angle, its power, and its timing had been calculated with surgical precision, striking exactly at the weakest point of her lance's defensive arc. This terrifying evolution in combat style had occurred in less than a single second. Eleanor bit her lip, her teeth digging into her skin as she slammed the control levers forward, attempting to use the sheer weight of her superior machine to shove the enemy back. To her horror, the battered Ursus mecha performed a ghostly, fluid sidestep. It moved with a grace that should have been impossible for a machine with a single arm and a mangled leg. Then, the third strike arrived. The black blade swung upward in a wicked arc, aiming directly for the mecha's armpit, the joint where the armor was thinnest and most vulnerable. Eleanor cursed under her breath, forced to retreat in a frantic scramble to avoid the lethal blow. The blade missed her vitals, but it shrieked across her side plating, leaving a deep, jagged gouge in the reinforced steel. Inside her cockpit, red warning lights began to pulse rhythmically, accompanied by a harsh electronic chime. A synthesized voice announced that the left armor integrity had dropped by 42%. This is impossible, Eleanor thought, her eyes wide with shock. She was piloting a custom-built machine of the Victoria Royal Knights, a masterpiece crafted by the Empire's finest smiths. Her opponent was using a piece of junk from a penal battalion, a machine that looked like it was held together by rust and spite. How could this be happening? She tried to create distance, but the Ursus mecha gave her no room to breathe. Its movements were becoming impossibly fast. Despite its damaged leg, it moved as if it were ignoring the laws of physics, closing the gap instantly. Sword light flashed again and again. Eleanor raised her lance to block the fourth strike, then the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. Every blow carried the weight of a falling mountain, and every angle was more sinister than the last. Eleanor's pupils contracted. She had always been a prodigy, graduating at the top of the Royal Knight Academy and becoming the youngest acting commander in the history of the 7th Regiment. She had defeated countless skilled pilots, but she had never seen a style like this. It was devoid of any human trace, no tactics, no rhythm, no feints. There was only pure, primal slaughter. It was as if the pilot was no longer a human being, but a wild animal trapped in a cage of iron. A sharp, metallic snap echoed through the square as Eleanor's lance was sheared through, a third of its length falling to the ground. She didn't have time to be horrified. She instinctively jerked her machine to the side as the black blade whistled past her shoulder, carving a deep scar through her family's crest. She had been inches away from being split in half. Finally, Eleanor cast aside her pride. She opened the wide-range comms and screamed to her unit, commanding them to surround the target and attack all at once. While the battle raged outside, Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov's consciousness was drifting in a vast, bottomless abyss of darkness. She could no longer feel her physical form. Her hands, her legs, even the steady thrum of her heartbeat had vanished into the void. There was only sound, a cacophony of voices surging from every direction like a rising tide. A gravelly male voice whispered in her ear, begging to be let out so he could kill them all, claiming his skills were superior. A sharp female voice shrieked about 3 years of waiting and a desperate need for revenge, demanding that Pavel move aside. More voices joined the fray, a chorus of the dead and the desperate, all clawing at her mind, trying to seize control of her body. Pavel felt a wave of profound nausea, not a physical sickness, but a deep, soulful loathing. These things, these parasitic remnants in her mind, were trying to use her hands to kill and her eyes to see. An old, frail voice drifted through the dark, coated in a layer of false kindness, telling her that her will was too weak and that she should simply surrender control to them. They promised to kill the Victorians for her. In the center of that mental storm, Pavel's consciousness coalesced into a faint, shimmering outline. A cold, mocking smile spread across her face. Her voice was quiet, nearly drowned out by the screaming souls as she asked them if they were joking. Outside, the situation for Eleanor had become a nightmare. 11 Victorian mechas had surrounded the lone Ursus machine, but the scrap heap showed no fear. Its movements were becoming even faster, more vicious, and increasingly alien. The black sword moved like a storm. When the first Victorian knight tried to flank it, the blade whipped around at an impossible angle, decapitating the machine in a shower of sparks and molten metal. Screams of terror erupted over the radio, as the knights realized the pilot's reaction time was beyond human limits. A second machine fell as the black sword pierced its chest. The red veins on the blade suddenly flared with a brilliant, hungry light. A scream echoed from the victim's cockpit, followed by a violent explosion. Eleanor's face went pale. She finally realized the true nature of that experimental weapon. It wasn't just a sword, it was absorbing something. With every kill, the red lines on the blade grew brighter, and the battered mecha moved with more fluidity and power. It was as if the sword was using the lives of the fallen as fuel to enhance its pilot. Eleanor ordered a full retreat, telling her men to maintain distance and use long-range fire. But as the command left her lips, the Ursus mecha suddenly stopped. A heavy silence fell over the square, broken only by the crackle of burning buildings. The machine stood amidst the wreckage of 4 Victorian knights, the black sword held low, its red veins pulsing like a living heart. Then, a sound began to emanate from the mecha's external speakers. It was laughter. It started as a low, raspy chuckle, but quickly spiraled into a frantic, hysterical, and utterly mad cacophony. It didn't sound like one person laughing. It sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in mirth at once. Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. The voice that came through the speakers was distorted, sounding like metal grinding against stone. It mocked them, asking if they really thought they could stop it. The mecha's head tilted up, its optical sensors glowing with a piercing, malevolent red light. It screamed that they were naive, the voice becoming sharper and more strained as if something was trying to burst out from within. The machine moved again, faster than ever before. Another Victorian knight was cleaved in two before it could even raise its shield. Pleas for mercy filled the comms, but the Ursus pilot was deaf to them. Inside the cockpit, Pavel was curled in her seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the controls with a death grip. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the fires of the battlefield, and she was laughing even as tears streamed down her face. She screamed at the voices in her head to shut up, forcing her will upon them. They were trying to flee now, terrified by her intensity, but she wouldn't let them go. If they wanted her body, she would take everything they had instead, their skills, their experience, their memories, and their very souls. She would take it all. The interior of the cockpit was thick with the suffocating, metallic tang of blood. It smeared the monitors and pooled in the crevices of the control seat. Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov was in a state of physical ruin. Blood leaked from the corners of her mouth, her nostrils, and even the tear ducts of her eyes, staining her pale skin in gruesome streaks. Yet, despite the agony racking her frame, she was laughing. It was the sound of a true madman, echoing hollowly against the reinforced glass. Inside the theater of her mind, the arrogant souls that had once tried to seize her body were now screaming in a chorus of pure terror. One by one, Pavel was hunting them down, tearing them into jagged fragments and devouring them whole. She was no longer just herself. She was becoming a composite of every warrior she consumed. The 37 years of close-quarters combat experience from a grizzled veteran were now hers to command. The lightning-fast reaction times of a legendary ace sniper were being hardwired into her synapses. Even the sheer, suicidal indifference to pain from a fanatic who had held a border post alone for a week was now the foundation supporting her broken body. In her mind, they were all screaming. They were all trying to flee, but there was no escape from the void she had become. This was her mind, her domain, and her absolute battlefield. A cold, synthetic voice cut through the internal carnage, though it sounded distant, as if heard through deep water. The system issued a series of urgent warnings. Warning: host physiological indicators are severely abnormal. Heart rate, 187 beats per minute. Blood pressure, critical threshold. Multiple capillary ruptures detected. Neural system load, 312%. Suggestion: cease combat immediately. For the first time, Pavel heard the voice with startling clarity, but she chose to ignore every word. She could feel her veins bulging and bursting beneath her skin, and her brain felt as though it were being pierced by 1,000 white-hot needles simultaneously. Yet, this excruciating pain brought with it a sense of clarity she had never known. She felt more alive in this moment of near death than she ever had in her previous life. Licking the copper-tasting blood from her lips, she let out a low, predatory growl and whispered, "Come on." Outside the cockpit, the village had been transformed into a literal slaughterhouse. 6 reinforcement mechas from the Victoria 3rd Night Regiment had just arrived on the scene, only to be met by a beast that had completely lost its shackles. The Ursus mecha moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, its motions as smooth as liquid mercury and as lethal as a strike from the abyss. Every swing of its blackened blade carried the weight of total annihilation, finding the microscopic gaps in the enemy's armor with impossible precision. "This shouldn't be possible," the vanguard captain of the 3rd Regiment screamed over the comms. He raised his heavy shield in a desperate bid for survival, but the black longsword arced through the air at an angle that defied the laws of physics. It bypassed the shield entirely, plunging deep into the cockpit. The red, vein-like patterns on the blade flared with a hungry light, and the knight didn't even have time to scream before his machine erupted into a towering fireball. The slaughter continued with mechanical efficiency. The 2nd mecha fell, then the 3rd, then the 4th. The Victorian machines were being harvested like ripe wheat before a scythe. Pavel's Punishment Battalion mecha was a walking corpse of a machine. Its left leg joint had finally seized up, forcing it to drag the paralyzed limb behind it like a broken wing. The chest armor had been torn open, leaving internal cables exposed like raw, pulsing entrails, and the transmission system shrieked with every movement, spitting out sparks and metal shards. But it did not stop. It would not stop. "Damn it, protect the commander!" The last 2 surviving knights of the 3rd Regiment cried out, throwing themselves into the path of the monster. It was a futile gesture. The black sword cleaved through their defenses as if they were made of paper. One mecha was stripped of both its arms in a single blur of motion, while the other was split down the center, its core detonating instantly. Eleanor von Schwartz found herself alone once more, facing the demon. Her riding lance was a jagged stump, and her mecha's armor hung in useless ribbons. She didn't flee, but her voice was a fragile, trembling thing as she spoke into the darkness. What are you?" The Punishment Battalion mecha slowly rotated its torso to face her. The red glow from its primary sensors looked like the fires of hell itself, locking onto her position with predatory intent. Then, it lunged. It was faster than any of its previous movements, a final, desperate burst of speed. Eleanor raised the remains of her lance to parry, but the strength behind the blow was beyond anything a human pilot should be capable of. A sickening crunch of metal echoed through the clearing as the lance shattered. The black blade didn't stop there. It sheared through the mecha's arm from the elbow down, sending a spray of molten metal and sparks into the air. Eleanor recoiled in sheer terror, watching as the sword rose again, aimed directly at her cockpit. She closed her eyes, bracing for the end. Then a strange silence fell. The killing blow never landed. Eleanor opened her eyes to see the Ursus mecha frozen in mid-swing, its blade hovering less than half a meter from her face, as if it had been turned to stone. Inside the cockpit, the system's voice was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. "Warning, host is nearing death. Estimated remaining survival time, 57 seconds. Detection of host consciousness intensity decreasing, rejection response weakening. Emergency protocol activated, forcibly taking over mecha control rights. Takeover complete. Executing priority directive, retreat." Pavel felt her mind being forcibly yanked away from the controls. She tried to fight it, her fingers clawing at the levers with the last of her strength. "No, not yet," she wheezed, her vision blurring into a gray haze. "I can still kill." "Executing mecha command, forced sedation," the system replied coldly. A sharp, icy jolt of electricity surged from the headrest into her spine. Pavel's hands slipped uselessly from the controls, and her head slumped forward. As her consciousness dissolved into an endless black void, the last thing she saw was her battered, broken machine turning away from the prey. It began to run, crashing through the remnants of the Victoria forces with a mindless, mechanical ferocity, leaving the burning village behind. Years later, the official military records of the Victoria Empire would refer to this event as the Night of Caldeburg. On the second day of the Frost Moon, in the year 403, the 7th and 3rd Night Regiments had launched a lightning strike intended to capture the fortress in 20 minutes. It was supposed to be the opening move of a glorious campaign. Instead, the intervention of a single, unidentified punishment battalion mecha turned the operation into a disaster. The battle lasted only an hour and 7 minutes, but in that time, 11 Royal Knight mechas were destroyed. The strategic delay allowed Ursus reinforcements to flood the zone, turning a swift victory into a 3-day slaughter that cost the Empire 3 times its projected casualties. The 7th Regiment was struck from the records, and Eleanor von Schwartz was stripped of her command, sent to the rear to live with the ghosts of that night. The mysterious mecha vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace of its pilot's identity. But from that night on, a new name began to be whispered in the trenches of both sides. The Victorian soldiers spoke of the ghost of Caldeburg with superstitious dread, while the soldiers of Ursus gave it a different name. They called it the Dawnbreaker, for it was the machine that had taken the Empire's Spear of Dawn and snapped it in two. The battle had spiraled completely out of control. Eleanor von Schwartz had never witnessed such absolute chaos in all her years of service. Fire was everywhere, licking at the ruins of what used to be a village. Explosions rocked the earth with rhythmic, bone-jarring thuds. Screams and wails of the dying filled the air, creating a symphony of despair. The one-sorterly blitzkrieg tactics of the Victorian army had dissolved into a boiling mess of failure. The communication channels were a cacophony of static and desperate, broken pleas for help. One voice crackled through the headset shouting, "The northern line has fallen. The 4th Mecha Division has cut our supply lines." Another voice screamed for support on the Eastern Front, reporting, 3 infantry regiments are closing in. We need backup now." From the west, a panicked soldier demanded to know, "Someone is firing on us. Is it friend or foe? Damn it, is it friend or foe?" The command center issued a final, grim notice. "All units be advised, the main force is being forced to split. Repeat, the main force is splitting." The core of this operation had been speed. Fast breakthroughs, fast segmentation, and fast annihilation. They were supposed to take Caldeburg in 20 minutes to clear the path for the advance. But that cursed punishment battalion mecha had ruined everything. A mere 10-minute delay was all it took. 10 minutes was enough for the Ursus Union commanders to seize a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to counterattack. Eleanor's mecha moved through the battlefield in a pathetic, broken state. Its left arm was gone, and her heavy riding lance was lost to the mud. The armor was shredded into jagged plates, and the power system barely hummed at minimum output. Her monitors were a sea of red warnings, flashing alerts for overheating, oil leaks, structural damage, and depleted ammunition. She couldn't even remember how she had escaped that village. After that monster in the black mecha disappeared, she thought the worst was over. She was wrong. Ursus mecha units swarmed from every direction like hungry wolves. The remnants of the 7th Night Regiment were scattered to the winds. She watched her teammates fall one by one. Heinrich's mecha was swarmed by 3 enemies, his cockpit pierced through by a heavy railgun. Jurgen's machine hit a mine while covering her retreat, his legs blown clean off at the joints. And Andreas. She didn't even know when Andreas had vanished into the smoke. Now the comms held nothing but the hiss of white noise. She was alone. "Damn it," Eleanor hissed, her teeth gritted as she maneuvered her scrap heap of a machine to dodge another incoming shell. The shockwave of the explosion made her seat vibrate violently, and the alarms were loud enough to drive her mad. A warning flashed across her HUD. Power core overheating. Cooling system failure. Estimated remaining operation time, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 4 minutes, that was all she had left before the machine became a coffin. Eleanor scanned her surroundings through the flickering external cameras. Wrecks and flames stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, Ursus mechas were closing in, at least 3, maybe more. She couldn't fight them. In her current state, she couldn't even take down a single scout. "Curse it all," she muttered to the empty cockpit. She made her choice. The mecha's chest plate hissed open, and the cockpit hatch rose with a mechanical groan. Eleanor leaped down to the scorched earth. A sharp, white-hot pain shot through her leg the moment she hit the ground. At some point during the battle, a jagged piece of metal had embedded itself in her thigh, but she hadn't even noticed the injury until the adrenaline began to fade. She didn't have time to dwell on it. She turned back for one last look at the machine that had been her companion for years. To a Victoria Royal Knight, a mecha was an extension of their very life, but now she had to leave it behind. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the cold metal. Then she turned and vanished into the darkness without looking back. Navigating the battlefield on foot was far harder than she had imagined. Debris was everywhere: shattered mechas, scorched tanks, and unidentifiable scrap. Metal fragments littered the ground, glinting eerily in the firelight. And then there were the bodies. Some wore Victorian uniforms, others Ursus, and many were burned beyond recognition. They lay in twisted poses, some stared at the sky with hollow eyes, while others were curled up as if still praying for a miracle that never came. Broken soldiers wandered aimlessly like soulless ghosts. They walked past Eleanor with empty gazes, not even acknowledging her presence. Some mumbled to themselves, but their voices were too faint to understand. Whenever an Ursus mecha thundered nearby, the ground shaking under its massive weight, Eleanor had to throw herself into piles of corpses. She held her breath and stayed perfectly still, praying the steel giants wouldn't notice a single living soul among the dead. She was armed only with a knight's saber and a standard-issue pistol. In a world of mechas, these were nothing more than toys. The pain in her leg grew worse with every step, feeling like a red-hot iron rod was being shoved into the wound. Blood soaked her boot, leaving a trail of crimson dots behind her in the ash. She didn't know how much longer she could walk, or even which direction she was heading. Time lost all meaning. It might have been an hour, or perhaps 2. Eleanor only knew she had to keep moving toward her own lines, toward safety. Suddenly, her leg gave out. She collapsed into a pile of rubble with a sharp gasp. "Ugh," she groaned, trying to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. The pain from her wound pulsed through her entire lower body. She thought to herself, maybe I could just lie here for a moment, maybe I should just give up. Then she heard it, a sound. It was faint and weak like the whimpering of a dying animal. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, her hand flying to the pistol at her waist. She scanned the ruins warily, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, in a heap of masonry, she saw a figure, a child. Eleanor crawled toward the figure, every movement a fresh agony. When she got close, she gasped in horror. It was a girl, no older than 15 or 16. She was curled in the rubble, covered in blood like a crushed insect. The girl was barely clothed, her body wrapped in blood-stained bandages that looked more like rags than medical supplies. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent, covered in bruises and horrific wounds. There were at least 3 piercing injuries: shoulder, abdomen, and thigh. Her body trembled unnaturally, suggesting severe spinal damage. Most shocking was her face. Dried blood coated her eyes, nose, and mouth, as if she had suffered massive internal hemorrhaging. Yet she was alive. Her chest rose and fell with a breath, so faint it could stop at any second. Eleanor's first instinct was caution. She checked the area and the girl for weapons, but found nothing. She asked herself, is she really just a child? No, Eleanor told herself, trying to stay cold. This wasn't her problem. As a Royal Knight of Victoria, her mission was to return to base. A heavy, dying burden would only slow her down and get her killed. She looked at the girl's bandages again. They weren't Victorian military issue. This girl was likely Ursus. An enemy. Logic told her to leave. Logic told her to put a bullet in the girl's head to be sure. You don't leave survivors on a battlefield. That was common sense. But Eleanor looked at that pale, blood-stained face. It was a face that still held the traces of childhood. She should have been in school, or at home, or laughing with friends. Instead, she was here in this hell. Eleanor thought of her own younger sister, the little girl who always followed her around, calling out, "Sister, sister." If it were her, if she were the one lying here. Damn it, Eleanor cursed under her breath. She wasn't sure who she was cursing, the war, the girl, or her own weakness. She sighed and leaned down, hoisting the girl onto her back. The girl was shockingly light, like a sheet of paper. Eleanor could feel the girl's protruding spine and ribs. She was gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten a real meal in a long time. Her body was ice cold, with only a fluttering heartbeat to prove she still lived. "You'd better not make me regret this," Eleanor whispered, unsure if the girl could even hear her. She took a deep breath and, dragging her injured leg, began to walk again. The weight on her back made every step a struggle, and her wound screamed in protest. But she didn't put the girl down. She wasn't ready to give up on herself, and she wasn't ready to give up on this child either. Who the hell authorized the punishment battalion to join the fray? Those lunatics have turned the entire battlefield into a chaotic mess. a high-ranking officer barked within the confines of the Ursus United Third Army Command. His subordinate paused, the sound of rustling papers filling the silence before he replied softly, "It was you who authorized it, sir." There was a long, heavy silence before the commander spoke again, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Delete that part when you finalize the records." This exchange was later found in the deleted communication logs of the Ursus headquarters. The roar of artillery never truly faded. In the distance, the sky was stained a deep, bruised orange, as if someone had set the very horizon ablaze. Flashes of explosions tore through the night, shredding the darkness into 1,000 jagged pieces. Eleanor von Schwartz had lost track of how long she had been walking. It might have been an hour, or perhaps 2, but time had lost all meaning. Her legs were leaden, her arms numb from the weight of the girl on her back. A girl who felt as light as a handful of feathers, yet carried the weight of Eleanor's entire world in this moment of madness. Eleanor could hardly remember how many enemies she had been forced to kill during her flight. She remembered the first one clearly. A lone Ursus soldier had rounded a corner in the ruins, his eyes widening in shock. Before he could even level his rifle, Eleanor's bullet had already torn through his throat. Then came the second and third. They were scavengers, picking through the rubble of a shattered street for supplies. She could have avoided them, but they stood directly in her path. 3 shots, 2 bodies. Then the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. The weight of her pistol grew lighter as the magazine emptied, until the final round was spent on a sniper lurking in the shadows. The sharp, metallic click of the firing pin hitting an empty chamber echoed through the cold night air. "Damn it," she hissed under her breath, realizing she was now defenseless. Eventually, she stumbled upon a sanctuary of sorts, the basement of a leveled building. It might have been a wine cellar or a storage room in a previous life. The entrance was partially obscured by a collapsed wall, hidden from any casual observer. It was a perfect hole to crawl into. With the last of her strength, Eleanor dragged herself and the girl into the suffocating darkness. She collapsed against the cold stone wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. The only light came from the flickering orange glow of the fires outside, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. The air was thick with the smell of mold and ancient dust, but it lacked the copper tang of fresh blood and the choking scent of cordite. For the first time in hours, it was quiet. Eleanor gasped for air, her lungs burning as if they were filled with hot coals. She looked down at her leg, seeing her trousers soaked through with dark, wet blood. The jagged metal shard was still embedded deep in her flesh, shifting painfully with every breath she took. She knew she had to deal with it now, or she wouldn't be walking again. But first, she turned her attention to the girl lying beside her. In the dim light, the child looked more like a corpse than a living being. Her skin was a ghostly pallor, her breathing so shallow it was almost non-existent. "Are you still with me?" Eleanor whispered, reaching out to press her fingers against the girl's neck. A pulse flickered there, weak, erratic, but undeniably present. "Still alive, then," Eleanor muttered to herself. "Then you'd better stay that way." She pulled her field medic kit from her belt. It was a standard Victorian issue. A few bandages, some disinfectant, tweezers, and a handful of syringes. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She started with her own leg, gripping the metal shard with the tweezers. She took a sharp breath and yanked it out in one fluid motion. She bit her lip so hard it bled, forcing back a scream that would have given away their position. Blood welled up, but she quickly cinched a tourniquet around her thigh and packed the wound with gauze. Once she was stable, she turned to the girl. As she unwound the girl's makeshift bandages, Eleanor froze. "Good God," she breathed, her voice trembling with a shock she hadn't felt all night. The girl's body was a living map of trauma. New wounds were layered over old scars, which were in turn layered over even older ones. Some were jagged, angry welts, others were festering with infection. Her skin was a mosaic of purple bruises, dark scabs, and white, aged tissue. It looked like a piece of cloth that had been torn and mended 100 times over. There were through-and-through gunshot wounds in her shoulder, abdomen, and thigh from today's battle. But there was more. Her ribs had been broken in at least 3 places and had healed poorly, leaving the bone misaligned. Her back was covered in irregular bruising, as if she had been whipped repeatedly. Her legs were peppered with tiny needle marks, arranged in a sickening, dense pattern. Eleanor forced herself to focus. She cleaned the shoulder wound first, grateful that it had missed the major arteries even if the muscle was shredded. She applied alcohol, the sharp scent filling the small space, and wrapped it tight. The abdominal wound was worse. The bullet had traveled at an angle, likely nicking internal organs. Eleanor wasn't a surgeon. She could only clean it and pray. Finally, she finished the thigh. The entire process took nearly an hour, and by the end, Eleanor's hands were shaking. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was what she had seen. The previous medical care this girl had received was barbaric. Wounds had been stitched without cleaning, bones left to set crookedly, burns left to rot under dirty rags. Eleanor's gaze finally settled on the girl's spine. There, she saw a row of neat, circular scars. They weren't from combat or torture, at least not in the traditional sense. They were mecha interface ports. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. As a Knight of Victoria, she knew exactly what those were. A pilot's nervous system had to be linked to the machine, usually through a mechanized spinal implant that made the connection safe and painless. But this girl had no implants. The probes had been shoved directly into her raw nerves and bone over and over again without any protection or anesthesia. The sheer agony of such a connection was unimaginable. Eleanor shook her head, trying to clear the horrific images from her mind. For now, they just had to survive the night. She would figure out what to do with this broken pilot once the fires died down. Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov drifted back to consciousness, though it felt less like waking up and more like being violently dragged from one nightmare into another. A deafening explosion tore through the silence, jolting her senses and rattling the very foundations of the world around her. Her head felt as though it were stuffed with damp cotton, a rhythmic, hammer-like throbbing echoing behind her eyes with every heartbeat. Every inch of her skin burned with a familiar, persistent agony, a sensation she had lived with for so long it was almost easy to ignore. She tried to roll over, her muscles screaming in a chorus of protest. Her arms felt like jelly, lacking the strength to even prop up her own weight. The world was a blur of shifting shadows and gray haze. Where was she? What had happened to her mecha? The memories began to return in jagged, painful fragments. The warehouse, the Victorian nights, the chaotic dance of battle, and that one night in the ornate armor. Then there was the pain, an endless, suffocating tide of it. She remembered the smell of iron, the sight of blood, and the sound of countless screams. She wondered to herself if she was dead. But the pain was too vivid, too real. The dead surely didn't hurt this much. If she could feel this miserable, she was definitely still alive. Pavel's eyes finally began to adjust to the gloom, and she realized she was in a cramped, stone-walled space. It looked like a basement. A sliver of light filtered through an entrance above, either the flickering glow of a distant fire or the cold touch of moonlight. She felt the weight of a heavy military greatcoat draped over her, a garment she didn't recognize as her own. Then she saw her. A woman sat against the far wall, her hand resting firmly on the hilt of a sword. She wore a tattered uniform, her leg wrapped in bandages that were already stained with dark, drying blood. On her chest, a golden emblem caught the faint light, a double-headed eagle with its wings spread wide. It was the unmistakable mark of the Victoria Empire. Pavel's mind went blank for a heartbeat. A single, cynical thought rose to the surface of her consciousness. Well, damn, this is it. I really should have just died back there. Another explosion rocked the earth nearby, causing the basement to shudder and dust to rain from the ceiling. Eleanor von Schwartz tightened her grip on her sword, her eyes fixed on the entrance with predatory intensity. When no one stormed in, she realized it was just another round of distant shelling. She began to lean back against the wall, but a rustling sound caught her attention. The girl was moving. Pavel rolled over with the clumsy, pained movements of a wounded animal, struggling to sit up. Her silver hair was matted with dust and dried blood, framing a face that looked far too weary for her years. When she finally looked up, her pale, sharp eyes met Eleanor's. Pavel's gaze drifted down to the golden eagle on Eleanor's chest. Her pupils contracted sharply, and her entire body went rigid. Eleanor watched the play of emotions across the girl's face. First a blank void, then confusion, followed by a flash of realization, and finally, a hollow, desperate sort of resignation. It was an expression that made Eleanor feel strangely unsettled. It wasn't the look of a terrified child. It was the look of someone who had expected nothing but the worst from fate and was simply confirming their suspicions. There was no screaming, no frantic struggle to escape. Pavel just sat there, watching Eleanor with a numb, glassy stare, as if waiting for a judge to read a death sentence. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but the girl beat her to it. Her voice was a raspy, fragile whisper asking, "So, what do you plan to do with me?" There was no fear in the question, nor was there a plea for mercy. It was a flat, exhausted inquiry. It was as if she had already accepted whatever end was coming. Eleanor blinked in surprise. She had expected tears or perhaps a desperate attempt to bolt for the door. Even if she was an enemy, she was barely more than 15 or 16 years old. But this response was entirely alien to a child's nature. Pavel then added with a flat tone, "Or you could just kill me. But if you do, could you make it quick? I've had a very long day." Eleanor stared at her for a long moment, the silence in the basement stretching thin. Then, unexpectedly, she let out a short, dry laugh. Pavel frowned, her eyes flashing with a flicker of renewed suspicion as she asked, "What's so funny?" Eleanor shook her head, sliding her sword back into its scabbard with a metallic click. She leaned back against the cold stone wall, her eyes never leaving the girl as she said, "Nothing. I just realized. You aren't at all what I imagined you'd be. If I wanted to kill you, I would have done it while you were unconscious." Pavel blinked, trying to process the shift in tone. She asked with confusion, "Then, what do you want from me?" Eleanor gave a self-deprecating smile and replied, "That's a good question. To be honest, I don't even know the answer myself." Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov stared at the Victoria Knight for a long time, her mind struggling to process the reality of her situation. It wasn't the physical pain that clouded her thoughts. She had long since grown accustomed to the agony of the neural probes and the bite of combat wounds. Rather, it was the sheer absurdity of the scene before her. She had been saved by an enemy. A knight of the Victoria Empire had reached into the wreckage and pulled out a pilot from an Ursus Penal Battalion. It was a scenario that defied all logic, a sequence of events so fundamentally wrong that it felt like a fever dream. In the silence of the cellar, Pavel's mind raced through a dozen different possibilities. Was this a trap? Was this some form of psychological softening before a brutal interrogation? Or perhaps, she wondered with a cold detachment, was it merely the result of some twisted, aristocratic whim? She watched the knight through narrowed eyes, taking in the details of her savior. The woman's military uniform was tattered and stained with grime. Blood seeped through the bandages wrapped around her limbs, and her eyes were clouded with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Though she leaned against the wall in a posture that seemed relaxed, Pavel could see the tension in her shoulders. She was a predator who could draw her blade in a heartbeat. No, Pavel realized, this wasn't a trap. The knight looked just as battered and desperate as she was. They were two ghosts haunting the same ruin. Pavel finally broke the silence, her voice raspy but steady. She asked, "What is the situation outside?" Regardless of the knight's intentions, Pavel knew she needed information before she could make her next move. Eleanor von Schwartz arched an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing her tired features. She remarked with a dry tone, "You're remarkably calm for someone in your position." Pavel stared back with an expressionless face and replied, "I am always calm. Please answer my question." It was a strange sight. A severely wounded, unarmed prisoner speaking to an armed enemy with the authority of a commanding officer. Yet, Eleanor did not take offense. Instead, she let out a soft, mirthless chuckle. Eleanor gestured with her chin toward the cellar's entrance and said, "Outside, it's hell." As if to punctuate her words, the muffled roar of a distant heavy artillery shell shook the earth, causing a fine layer of dust to drift down from the cellar ceiling. Eleanor continued, her voice laced with a bitter irony. "The battlefield has turned into a complete disaster. This was supposed to be a perfect blitzkrieg. 20 minutes to break the line, 30 minutes to occupy the stronghold. Clean, efficient, and decisive." She paused, a look of grim reflection passing over her face, before adding, "Instead, it has devolved into this nightmare." Pavel listened in silence. She had fragmented memories of the chaos, the thunderous charge of the Victoria Knights, the overwhelming wall of fire from the Ursus batteries, and the screaming voices that had flooded her mind through the neural link. Her hand instinctively tightened against the rough fabric of the military greatcoat draped over her. Eleanor shifted her weight and explained, "Now, both sides are fighting over these ruins like dogs over a bone. My unit was scattered, my communicator is trashed, and my leg—" She looked down at her heavily bandaged limb and finished with a self-deprecating smirk, "is not exactly in peak condition." Pavel's gaze followed Eleanor's to the wound. The bandages were already soaked through with fresh blood. Judging by the dark staining at the edges, the injury had been sustained hours ago, likely from jagged metal shrapnel. Pavel had seen thousands of such wounds. They weren't immediately fatal, but they were treacherous. Without proper care and rest, a wound like that would turn a soldier into a liability, especially in a retreat. Pavel stated flatly, "So, you need to cross the entire engagement zone to reach your own lines." Eleanor nodded in admission, saying, "Yes, one person, one bad leg, and at least 3 kilometers of active battlefield to navigate." She leaned her head back against the cold stone wall, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment as she admitted, "It sounds like a lovely stroll, doesn't it?" Pavel did not offer a joke in return. 3 kilometers through an active war zone was a death sentence for a lone, hobbled soldier. Eleanor was a knight, and her combat prowess was undoubtedly formidable, but a leg injury would destroy her mobility and endurance. And as for herself, Pavel looked down at her own body. She was wrapped in bandages and covered by Eleanor's coat. She tested her limbs, her fingers twitched, and her knees could bend. It hurt like 1,000 knives stabbing into her joints, but she could move. However, she was unarmed and broken. If the knight chose to kill her now, she wouldn't have the strength to resist. If the knight chose to drag her back as a prisoner, the Victoria POW camps were rumored to be places where death was a mercy. Pavel spoke up suddenly, her voice cutting through the gloom. She said, "Perhaps I can help you." Eleanor froze, her eyes snapping open. She asked with confusion, "What?" "I can help you cross the battlefield," Pavel repeated, her voice remaining eerily level. "I am intimately familiar with this sector. I know the patrol routes, the locations of the minefields, and the hidden paths that offer the best cover." This was no lie. Before her mission to raid the supply depot, Pavel had memorized every topographical detail of the surrounding area. While the shelling had certainly altered the landscape, the fundamental geography remained the same. Eleanor narrowed her eyes, her gaze piercing. She asked, "What are you suggesting?" Pavel looked her straight in the eye and replied, "A trade. I will guide you through the war zone. In exchange, you will not kill me, and you will not hand me over to a prisoner of war camp." A heavy silence descended upon the cellar. Eleanor stared at the young girl, her ice-blue eyes shimmering with a complex mix of suspicion and calculation. She eventually asked, "Do you even know who I am?" Pavel answered without a moment's hesitation, "A Mecha Knight of the Victoria Empire. Judging by your insignia, you aren't just a common soldier, you're likely a high-ranking noble." Pavel knew that nobles who clung to their sense of honor were often the most reliable when it came to oaths, even those made to an enemy. If she could secure a promise, she might actually survive. She continued, her voice analytical, "Based on your injuries, you survived a mecha duel and were forced to eject and retreat. Anyone who survives the first wave of an Ursus charge is no amateur." Eleanor looked genuinely taken as she remarked, "Your powers of observation are quite sharp for a child." She then added coolly, "Since you've deduced that much, you should also know that someone of my station does not make deals with the enemy." "And yet, you saved me," Pavel pointed out. She tilted her head slightly and said, "If you wanted to follow the rules, you should have finished me off while I was unconscious. Or you could have simply left me to rot in the rubble. But you didn't. You saved me, you treated my wounds, and you even gave me your coat. You have already broken your rules, knight." Eleanor clicked her tongue, unable to find a rebuttal. Pavel was right. From the moment she had decided to carry this girl out of the fire, she had stepped off the path of a traditional imperial knight. The two of them sat in silence for a long time, each weighing the risks of trusting the other. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation she couldn't quite hide. She asked, "So, you are from a penal battalion? I saw the marks on your body." Pavel's expression twitched momentarily as she confirmed, "I am." Eleanor said slowly, "The 404th Independent Mecha Penal Battalion, the unit made of criminals and death row inmates, the cannon fodder." Pavel sighed and replied, "Your intelligence is accurate, though I prefer to think of it as a highly proactive, alternative correctional institution." Eleanor was momentarily stunned by the response, unsure if the girl was being sarcastic or if her mind had simply been warped by the horrors she had endured. She looked at the girl, a child who should have been in school or at home, yet bore scars that would make a veteran weep. She asked, What crime did you commit? Does it matter? Pavel asked in return. Eleanor looked away and admitted, no, I suppose it doesn't. What mattered was the cold reality of the girl's existence. She spoke with a detachment that was far too old for her years. Eleanor then asked, if I agree to this deal, what do you plan to do once we reach our lines? Pavel blinked. It was a question she had already considered. She answered, once we arrive, you let me go. It is as simple as that. And then you go back to your penal battalion? Eleanor asked with a frown. Pavel paused, then replied, that depends. Depends on what? Eleanor pressed. On whether or not I have already been declared dead, Pavel explained. The rules of the penal battalion are very efficient. If a soldier is missing for a certain amount of time, they are marked as KIA. The military doesn't have to pay out death benefits for us, so they can redistribute our rations to the living and give our ID numbers to the next unlucky soul immediately. It's very streamlined. Eleanor's brow furrowed as she asked, and what happens if a dead soldier suddenly turns up alive? Pavel's eyes flashed with a strange, cynical light. She held up one finger and said, two possibilities. First, I am accused of desertion and faking my death. She held up a second finger and continued, second, I am accused of being turned by the enemy and sent back as a spy. Regardless of which one they choose, the result is the same. Eleanor whispered the word, execution. Execution, Pavel confirmed with a nod. If I'm lucky, it's a firing squad. If I'm unlucky, well, the Ursus military has many creative artists in their disciplinary branch. Eleanor found herself speechless. The girl was discussing her own potential execution with the same casual tone one might use to discuss the weather. There was no fear, no anger, only a numb, hollow acceptance of the world's cruelty. Eleanor summarized, so your plan is to help me and then I go to confirm if I am officially dead, Pavel interrupted. If I'm not, I go back. If I am, then I will find another way. What kind of way? Eleanor asked. I'll figure that out when the time comes, Pavel said as she stretched her aching body. I'm quite good at improvising. Eleanor looked at her, feeling the weight of the absurdity. A royal knight of Victoria and a condemned prisoner of Ursus working together to survive. If they were caught, Eleanor would be court-martialed for treason and the girl would be... Well, her fate was already grim, but Eleanor looked at her leg again. The pain was a constant, throbbing reminder of her limitations. She could walk, but she couldn't run, and she couldn't sustain a long march alone. Eleanor finally said, fine, I accept your deal. You lead the way, and I will protect you. Once we are near our lines, I will let you go. She leaned forward, her voice turning sharp as she added, but if you try any tricks. You will kill me, Pavel finished for her. She nodded and said, I know. Good, Eleanor said, nodding in return. When do we leave? Pavel tilted her head, listening to the rhythm of the world above. The thunder of the cannons was still constant, but the intervals between the blasts were growing longer. The most intense phase of the night battle was beginning to wane. She replied, we wait for the shelling to pause. It should be soon. Eleanor suddenly asked, what is your name? Pavel paused, surprised by the personal question. She answered, Pavel. My name is Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov. Eleanor nodded and introduced herself. I am Eleanor von Schwartz. Von Schwartz, Pavel noted with a slight lift of her brow. So you really are a noble. I am, Eleanor replied, her voice tinged with a complex emotion. Though right now, I am just a knight who lost her battle. Pavel didn't push for more details. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes, saying, then, Miss Schwartz, I suggest we both get some rest. The road ahead will not be easy. The document was cold, clinical, and final. It read, 400-4631 Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov. Status, killed in action, confirmed. Remarks, mecha wreckage recovered. No remains found in the cockpit, presumed vaporized or crushed by artillery fire. Pavel stared at the report, her brow twitching with a mix of disbelief and dark amusement. She thought to herself, damn it, I'm not even dead yet. She was crouched in the ruins of a half-collapsed communication station, her fingers clutching the crumpled, blood-stained piece of paper. She had scavenged it only 10 minutes ago from the body of a fallen signalman. The poor soul had likely been struck by a stray bullet during the chaotic retreat, clutching his dispatch bag to his chest even in death. It had been filled with damage reports and personnel updates, the mundane paperwork of a losing war. Pavel had flipped through the pages, hoping for tactical intelligence, only to find her own name staring back at her from the list of the fallen, presumed vaporized or crushed by artillery fire. She read the line again, the words feeling heavy and strange. They spoke of her as if she were nothing more than a bar of soap tossed into a furnace, leaving no trace behind. She looked down at her own body, checking her limbs. Her hands were there, grimy and scarred. Her feet were firmly planted on the rubble. Though her body ached as if she had been run over by a heavy truck, she was very much a complete, flesh-and-blood human being. She whispered to the empty, dusty air, "I'm still breathing, for God's sake." But the paper did not lie, at least not to the 404th Independent Mecha Penal Battalion. To them, Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov, number 44631, had met a glorious end on the field of battle. Her mecha had been hauled away for scrap, her absence from the cockpit noted, and her death finalized with clinical efficiency. No body meant no body bag, and no body bag meant one less resource to waste. It was clean. It was efficient. It was exactly how the penal battalion operated. Pavel stared at the paper for a long time, her expression twisting into a grimace. A strange, unidentifiable feeling surged within her. It wasn't anger. Anger was a luxury she had long ago learned not to waste her energy on. It wasn't sadness either. Sadness required something worth mourning, and she had nothing in the penal battalion to miss. Instead, it was a faint sense of collapse. Everything she had built in that hell, her rank, her position, the fragile rules of survival she had mastered, had been wiped out by a single sheet of paper. She began to wonder what would happen if she tried to return. She could imagine herself walking up to a commander and saying, "Sir, I'm not dead. The report is wrong." But she knew the reality. She would be branded a deserter, a traitor, or both. She would be dragged to the center of the camp and shot in front of the other prisoners as a warning. If she were unlucky, the more sadistic officers would find a more agonizing way to dispose of her. A dry, hollow laugh escaped her lips. She was dead. Pavel Ivanovich Sokolov was dead and gone, leaving not even a corpse behind. In a way, it was almost a relief. Dead people didn't have worries. They didn't have impossible missions, they didn't have to wonder where their next meal was coming from, and they didn't have to worry about being woken up by a rifle butt to the ribs in the middle of the night. A dead person could lie quietly in a corner and never have to deal with any more nonsense. The only problem was that this particular dead person was still breathing, her ribs still throbbed with every breath, and she was still squatting in a ruined station holding her own obituary. Pavel folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She wasn't sure why, but she wanted to keep it. Perhaps it was a souvenir or a joke she could tell one day if she survived. She imagined herself saying, "Look, here's my death certificate. Official certification, no fakes allowed." She stood up, stretching her stiff neck until it popped. Since there was no going back to the Ursus lines, only one path remained. She would follow the Victoria Knight until she found a new way forward. For now, she would have to play the part of a ghost. Pavel slipped out through a gap in the ruins, moving back toward their hiding spot. The sky outside was a haunting shade of dark red, the reflection of distant fires burning against the low-hanging clouds. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, charcoal, and the all-too-familiar stench of decay that clung to every corner of the battlefield. She moved quickly, her footsteps light and silent against the debris. Despite spending most of her time inside the cockpit of a mecha, she found she had a natural affinity for navigating this wasteland on foot. Eleanor was waiting exactly where she had left her, leaning against a broken wall. The Victoria Knight held a scavenged rifle, her eyes scanning the surroundings with sharp, weary alertness. When Pavel appeared from the shadows, Eleanor's gaze softened, though she did not lower her weapon entirely. Eleanor asked in a low, cautious voice, "How is it?" Pavel didn't answer immediately. She crouched down opposite the knight, pulled the folded paper from her pocket, and handed it over. Eleanor took the sheet, unfolded it, and scanned the text. Her expression remained neutral, though her eyebrows rose slightly as she reached the end. Eleanor read the words aloud, her voice tinged with irony, "Presumed vaporized or crushed by artillery fire. A tragic end. Your Ursus clerks certainly have a flair for the dramatic." Pavel replied with a flat, matching tone, "Don't they? I thought it was quite literary myself." Eleanor handed the paper back to her. So, you are officially dead. Dead as a doornail, Pavel said, refolding the paper and tucking it back into her pocket. Officially certified and stamped by the state. A heavy silence fell between them, punctuated only by the distant, sporadic crackle of gunfire that served as an ominous background track to their conversation. Eleanor eventually broke the silence, asking, "What do you plan to do now?" Pavel looked at her, her eyes devoid of any lingering hesitation. She said, her voice as calm as if she were stating a simple fact, "I can't go back. I might as well go with you." Eleanor arched an eyebrow in surprise. That wasn't the original deal. No, it wasn't, Pavel admitted. The plan was to get you near your lines and then I'd go back to check the situation. Well, the situation is checked. I'm a dead woman and dead women have nowhere to return to. She paused for a moment before adding, "So, the plan has changed." "To what?" Eleanor pressed, her eyes searching Pavel's face. "To me seeing you all the way back to your people, and then," Pavel shrugged, "and then we'll see." Eleanor repeated the words with a frown, "We'll see. What kind of plan is that?" "A flexible one," Pavel answered without missing a beat. "I told you before, I'm very good at adapting to new circumstances." Eleanor stared at her for a long moment, her ice-blue eyes filled with a complex mix of scrutiny and something else Pavel couldn't quite identify. Finally, she spoke, her voice very low. "Do you realize what this means? Coming with me to the Victoria lines. Do you understand the weight of that choice?" "It means I'm a total traitor to Ursus," Pavel answered instantly, showing no sign of inner conflict. "It means I go from being a KIA penal soldier to a deserting penal soldier. It means if any Ursus soldier recognizes me in the future, I'll die a lot worse than what's written on that report." She tilted her head slightly. "Did I miss anything?" Eleanor was momentarily speechless. She looked at the girl before her, a child who had just discovered her country had declared her dead, discussing her own betrayal with such chilling numbness. There was no hesitation, no struggle, not even a hint of a moral burden. It was as if they weren't discussing life, death, and treason, but simply which road to take to avoid the rain. Eleanor struggled to find the right words, eventually asking, "Don't you feel anything about it? About betraying your own side?" Pavel blinked, appearing to give the question genuine thought. "My country threw me into a penal battalion for reasons I don't even know," she said, her voice peaceful rather than angry. "My country sent me out in a piece of junk mecha that could fall apart at any second just to act as cannon fodder. My country declared me vaporized less than a few hours after I went missing because they couldn't be bothered to look for a body." She paused, then added, "I'm not sure what there is about a country like that worth not betraying." Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but found she had no rebuttal for such cold logic. Pavel continued, "Besides, I don't think I was ever much of a patriot. I'm on this battlefield because I was a prisoner, not because I wanted to protect the motherland. I fight because the alternative is death, not because of some noble ideal." She shrugged her shoulders. "So, the word betrayal doesn't really mean much to me." "You are a very strange person," Eleanor remarked, her voice softening. "I know," Pavel replied simply. "I've heard that before." Eleanor sighed, shifting her weight as she prepared to move. "Fine, if you've made up your mind, I won't argue with you." "When do we leave?" Pavel asked, her focus shifting back to the immediate task. Eleanor stood up, her movements stiff and pained as her injured leg continued to plague her. "Now, while it's still dark, we need to get as far as we can before the sun comes up." Pavel stood as well, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Which way?" Eleanor pointed toward the northwest. "The main Victoria force is that way. As I mentioned, it's about 3 kilometers from here." She frowned as she looked at the terrain. "But the straight-line distance is meaningless. We'll have to bypass at least 3 active combat zones to get there safely." "I know the way," Pavel said. She reached down and picked up a rifle from a nearby corpse, checking the magazine with a practiced hand. There were 7 rounds left. It was a meager defense, but better than nothing. "Follow me. Step exactly where I step. I have a rough idea of where the mines are in this area." Eleanor looked at her with surprise. "How could you possibly know the mine layout here?" "Because I'm the one who laid them," Pavel said simply, turning her back to lead the way into the shadows of the ruins.